Welcome to the 2017 State of Racial Justice in Chicago Leadership Summit. My name is Ivan Arenas. I'm the Associate Director for Community Partnerships at the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, which we shorten to IRRPP. We know you're very busy people who are hard at work addressing many of the concerns that surface in IRRPP's A Tale of Three Cities report, and we greatly appreciate and value taking the time to be here today, so thank you very much. It's my pleasure to now introduce Tyrone Foreman, Associate Chancellor and Vice Provost for Diversity at the University of Illinois at Chicago. As UIC's Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Foreman is responsible for ensuring that efforts to expand access, promote equity, and enhance inclusion are key considerations in all major budgetary, administrative, and governance decisions. And so please help me welcome Dr. Foreman, who's going to offer you welcome on behalf of UIC and get our day started.
So I'm honored to be here this morning as Associate Chancellor and Vice Provost for Diversity, and on behalf of our Chancellor Michael Amaritis and our Provost Susan Poser, I'd like to welcome you all today here to UIC. We are here this morning to continue and hopefully advance discussions on the state of racial and ethnic justice in Chicago. As a minority-serving institution with approximately 6 in 10 of our students self-identifying as racial ethnic minority and over half of our students receiving Pell Grants, we take seriously our public mission and land grant commitment to not only expand educational pathways for low-income and underrepresented students, but also to ensure that we create knowledge that transforms our views of the world, and through sharing and application, they transform the world. So UIC welcomes this important convening because it believes it will strengthen our institutional efforts to better serve the diverse communities within and around our university. Specifically, today's event brings together a diverse set of stakeholders who are committed to promoting racial justice in our city. By bringing together all of you all in one room, the current issues of our time, imagining what a more just city might look like, it is our hope that you leave here today with renewed inspiration, new collaborative strategies, and perhaps even more essential, concrete action steps for addressing racial and ethnic inequalities in Chicago that remain persistent, pervasive, and consequential. Many of these inequities facing Chicagoans today are highlighted in a recent report released earlier this week by the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. The report, titled A Tale of Three Cities, The State of Racial Justice in Chicago, offers a timely analysis of how racial and ethnic groups are faring in Chicago on key indicators of inequality within the interacting and overlapping areas of housing, economics, education, justice, and health. In keeping with a commitment to knowledge in the service of transformation, it is hoped that this report is not merely a statement on racial dynamics in Chicago today, but rather it is hoped that the report serves as a catalyst for prompting a long overdue, sustained conversation and action agenda about Chicago's racial past, present, and future. In partnership with the Chicago Community Trust, today's event is sponsored by UIC's Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, and I want to say a couple of words about the Institute. The Institute promotes, coordinates, and conducts innovative research at the intersections of race, ethnicity, and public policy. It strives to increase the quantity, the quality, and ultimately the impact of this research, both at the intellectual and the practical variety. Among the Institute's central aims is to increase knowledge about racial and ethnic groups nationally and here in Chicago, so that root causes of inequalities these groups may face and are better understood. The idea is that by understanding the root causes, the Institute can advance in partnership with citizens, practitioners, policymakers, evidence-based public policies that will be more viable and effective in ameliorating racial inequity in our city. The Institute is a key resource on our campus that has been and will continue to be a space where diverse groups of faculty, students, and community members are welcomed, valued, and supported. It is also a resource for expanding the breadth and depth of engaged research. In closing, I would like to publicly acknowledge and thank the director, Amanda Lewis, and her staff for their hard work and their leadership, as well as congratulate the various partners who have helped put together this very important convening. The university looks forward to collaborating with you all on the good work that will follow from this leadership summit. Thank you very much.
Welcome. My name is Amanda Lewis, and I am the director of the Institute for Research on Public Policy and also a faculty member here at UIC in Sociology and African American Studies. I am going to try to, in about 12 minutes, tell you a little bit about how we got to this day and give you some of the highlights of the report. So one of the central aims of the Institute is to increase knowledge about the experiences and conditions of racial and ethnic groups nationally, but especially locally in the city of Chicago. We started talking about this report actually about 18 months ago when I had the dubious distinction of following in Beth Ritchie's footsteps as the new director of IRRPP. And we started really thinking about looking around for trying to find recent comprehensive data on the condition of different racial and ethnic groups in the city. We knew that the realities of Chicagoans' daily lives were far more complex than the picture of supposedly violent community described in a lot of national news stories at the time. We knew that in every neighborhood we find friends and families barbecuing, hardworking young people trudging to school with heavy backpacks, parks filled with residents walking, playing, and exercising. We knew communities were full of immigrants working overtime to make ends meet, and yet we also knew that even as Chicagoans of all racial and ethnic groups want to live in safe and healthy communities where they don't just subsist or survive but also thrive, not all have equal access. We wondered at the time, what are the current social and economic conditions that are undergirding gun violence in the city? What was the impact of the recession on different racial and ethnic groups? What are children's experiences in schools in Chicago? How has the economic recovery improved or not improved the conditions of different kinds of workers? How does Chicago compare to national trends on health inequities? When we looked, we found actually a lot of different centers, scholars, or other policy organizations around the city that had produced important work on specific aspects of inequality. We learned a great deal from this work, and we thank those colleagues, many of whom are here today, for their work, and we've talked to them throughout this process. However, nowhere could we find a source that brought together information about multiple dimensions of inequality in one place. Working with limited resources, I'm sure many of you have heard about a little budget situation we have in the state these days, we tried not to duplicate efforts that other researchers and colleagues had already completed. Thus, we draw on and try to lift up all the important work that's already happening in the report. Where information was not readily available, we committed ourselves to a challenging but necessarily limited agenda. We would not collect new data, but instead would draw on available secondary sources. In doing so, we pursued a dual goal of locating information about racial and ethnic inequality on multiple indicators in one central place and making this information as accessible as possible. We want to say outright, we recognize that the report is not truly a report on the conditions of all racial and ethnic groups in the city of Chicago. Having to rely on secondary sources meant that data across many indicators were either unreliable or unavailable for numerically small but important and growing communities in the city. This includes Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, Arab Americans. To this end, we hope that the report can be used by us and others as a spur for new research. To at least partially fill this gap, you'll find in the report short qualitative commentaries by experts in their areas to capture some of the key challenges some of these groups are facing. We named the final report A Tale of Three Cities, and now I need to give a big shout out to Chris Mooney, who must have suggested that title at least 3 times before we were able to really take in the suggestion. Chris is the director of the Institute on Government and Public Affairs. And we named it this because as we worked to try to make sense of the wide-ranging data, now we really understand why nobody tried to do this before in this way. There really isn't one Chicago experience. There are several. Conditions in Chicago for the city's 3 largest racial and ethnic groups today are dramatically different. While we don't have space in this report to detail the history of racial dynamics in the city, there's no way to understand where we are today without acknowledging that history. Segregated communities emerged in the 20th century as a result of federal, state, and local policies and practices. As Richard Rothstein, author of the new book, The Color of Law, put it, segregation is not the unintended effect of benign policies. It was an explicit, racially purposeful policy that was pursued at all levels of government. Redlining is just one oft-cited example which had the consequence in practice of making black neighborhoods ineligible for federal housing loans, along with many private mortgages and insurance, at precisely the time that the federal government was making the largest push in history to make home ownership possible for working Americans. Consequently, black Americans were, for all practical purposes, locked out of the greatest mass-based opportunity for wealth accumulation in American history. That long history is embedded not only in patterns of homeownership and the demographics of our neighborhoods, but in the placement of freeways and public housing, and in the organization of our schools and healthcare systems. Across the sections of the report, we discover again and again that present-day challenges we face stem in part from our failure to address the long-term consequences of decades of formal and widespread private and public discrimination. Inequality is not merely an inherited legacy of the past, however. We still contend with many forms of entrenched but subtle institutional and interpersonal forms of discrimination. This is one of the challenges today, to understand how the mechanisms might be different or look different than they were in the past. For example, as we talk about in detail in the report, significant racial disparities persist not only in access to home loans today, but in the kinds of loans different groups tend to receive. So in the past, we had a formal, explicit redlining, and now we get the kinds of things that we saw in the Wells Fargo lawsuit, the state prosecuted not too long ago, where banks are offering different communities vastly different kinds of opportunities to get affordable loans. The central finding in this report is that racial and ethnic inequities in Chicago remain pervasive, persistent, and consequential across domains. These inequities affect the lives of Chicagoans in every neighborhood. They have not just spatial, but also deep historical roots and are embedded in our social institutions. And they have powerful effects on the lived experiences and opportunities of all Chicagoans. We find that Black and Latinx Chicagoans are overrepresented on the bottom end of most every indicator of inequality available, and that white Chicagoans tend to be overrepresented at the top. And again, we want to emphasize it's really important to pay attention to the kind of relational part of this, right? To be sure, considerable changes have transpired in the city's racial and ethnic landscape over the past half century, but levels of inequity among Chicago's major racial and ethnic groups remains pervasive. We examine multiple domains in the report because it's often hard to understand realities in one domain without attention to others. For example, when we consider the deep levels of segregation in Chicago, we are concerned because where people live shapes their proximity to quality public education, the availability and variety of public amenities, their access to quality health care and social services, their exposure to or insulation from pollutants and other kinds of environmental hazards, and their immediate access to jobs, among many other factors associated with well-being and social mobility. The advantages or disadvantages people have translate into parallel disadvantages or advantages in other domains. So we hope you've had a time at least to glance or look through this report, recently described in the Sun-Times as lengthy. Take that as a compliment, maybe. I want to just highlight a few of the tensions, and then I'm going to turn it over to our first panel of esteemed guests who will help us to begin to think about where to go next. And just a few things I want to highlight here. One of the tensions, and these are just some of the things that we grappled with a lot as we pulled the report together. One of the important nuances is the way that race and class intersect. We see in the report all the different ways that social mobility can help. The more education you get, unemployment rates drop, income goes up, right? Obvious kinds of relationships. But we've seen that racial gaps persist even at the highest levels of education. Race means that segregation levels remain high even for the highest income blacks, right? People don't always realize, they think this is just about economics, and it's not entirely. We live in a moment in this city of concentrated advantage as well as concentrated disadvantage. And it's clearly true that having more resources helps, but the protective functions of class don't generalize equally across groups. Part of this is because the massive positional inequalities that we capture in the report regularly feed widespread cultural beliefs and stereotypes about groups. And in this way, for example, rampant anti-Blackness in our society shapes daily experiences for all, including their home values, their school placements, their access to loans, their interactions with doctors, with teachers, with police officers, with realtors. Another data point that we have okay data on, this is one of those places where we actually need somewhat better local data. Nationally, we know that wealth gaps are huge. They're more consequential and much larger than gaps in income levels. Many scholars talk about these gaps as capturing the congealed effects of centuries of structural racism. They reflect different historic opportunities for wealth accumulation, as I talked about earlier, and they are not about differential savings rates, right? These are about intergenerational transfers of wealth from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild. Whatever their origins, though, they translate into dramatically different abilities to make decisions about where to live, to send your child to the school you want to send them to, the ability to pay your rent. One measure that we have here locally is a measure of liquid assets. Do you have any cash on hand to weather a bump in the road? Can you handle a brief layoff from a job? Can you handle a random accident on Lakeshore Drive, like the one I had 2 days ago, right? Where suddenly you're faced with needing to have $1,000 on hand or more. And the answer for too many Chicagoans is no. That small things come up and they can turn into big disasters. And here we see that a majority of Blacks and over 70% of Latinos in the city of Chicago are liquid asset poor. They don't have cash on hand to weather these kinds of challenges. Another dimension that raises these questions is how we think about the many forms of violence that Chicagoans contend with. As Beth Ritchie has written about, interpersonal violence is only one form, and we need to pay attention to. So while at this moment in Chicago, it's impossible to ignore the really devastating impact of gun violence, the other hard truth we must face is that far more Chicagoans die early every year, every day, from the effects of structural violence than they do from interpersonal violence. As David Williams puts it, several hundred Black folks in this country die every day who would not die if the health of Blacks and whites were equal. This is partly about differential access to health care, differential experiences within the healthcare system, but also about the ways that racism gets into our bodies. And about the effects of structural racism, as health scholar Paul Farmer put it, the term structural violence is one way of describing social arrangements that put individuals and populations in harm's way. The arrangements are structural because they are embedded in the political and economic organization of our social world, and they are violent because they cause injury and harm. And looking through the maps in the report, you will see that segregated Black and Latino communities in Chicago are struggling with the effects of structural violence. Effects such as limited access to jobs, health care, healthy food, etc. I'm going to just share a couple more just quick data points. One of the other things we see is that, as there was a recent article, I think The Atlantic, it said it's expensive to be poor. And what we find over and over again is that poor folks are paying far more for housing. As you see here, Latinos and Blacks are much more likely to be cost burdened when they're owners, and actually even more so when they're renters. The effects of the housing crisis had quite differential effects in the city. Some of the things we talked about earlier were related to wealth and whether one can weather a financial storm. Ended up having huge impacts in where foreclosures were concentrated throughout the city. And you can see this not only obviously concentrated on the south and west sides, not only in regards to homes, individual ownership, but also in regard to renting. There's lots of important data from the Voorhees Neighborhood Center and from the Paul Housing Center that shows that the dramatic drop in affordable rental housing throughout the city. I'm going to skip through some of the data on education, which is in the report. I think one of the other things that we draw attention to, it's hard, some people have asked us questions about what does it mean to raise all these questions about the need for investment at a time when the state is supposedly broke. And I think one of the things that hit us over and over again as we're doing the report is that, in fact, the state is spending a lot of money in certain areas. And the question is, how do we think about shifting the priorities of our spending. You'll see in the section on justice that we have been making massive investments over the last 20 or 30 years in incarceration in the state. Despite a 30-year drop in crime rates in the city are now lower than they've been in 30 years. At the lowest point, we have the most overcrowded prisons in the country. And as some of our colleagues in this, other scholars have recently done, these are data visualizations from the group Data Made. There are lots of communities in the city in which we were spending over $1 million per block on incarceration. And one can imagine, especially in communities like Austin and Humboldt Park, those are also areas that are also highlighted in deep colors when we talk about foreclosures, when we talk about concentration of low-performing schools, and to think differently about how we invest in our communities. So I'm going to skip over some of this so we get to the panel. So I want to make a couple quick acknowledgments. One is to say that we all know, and this community in this room knows, in fact, that we can do better. It will take significant effort by many of us to make headway on the challenges, but in fact, we brought this room together because all of you are already working on these questions in different domains, and we want to try to make connections, make leaps, make new efforts that we can do jointly to try to address these issues. We all collectively need to feel a sense of great responsibility to ensure that our neighbors near and far have the opportunity to live full, healthy, and dignified lives. I want to thank all of our partners who worked with us on the report. This is where I get to say a few thank yous, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to come up. Many of you sat down with us at various points. We sent Dina out into the world about a year ago to ask people what are the indicators we should be looking at, where's the best data on this, how do we do this, and many of you were very generous in meeting with us and giving us advice, pointing us to the work that you'd already been doing. And we want to thank all of you, especially the colleagues who provided expert commentary in the different sections of the report, who helped us make sense of what we see, and who helped fill the gaps by providing their expertise on groups whose experiences are otherwise missing from the report. We name all of those people in the report itself. I won't go through it now. The list is too long. I also want to give a big thanks to Casey Henricks, who's hiding over in the other corner, but has the dapper matching pocket square. I don't think he realized what he was getting himself into when we sort of lured him into being a postdoc at IRRPP this year, but he has had the largest hand in making this report a reality, and we want to thank him for all his hard work. Dina Lewis just walked out of the room, but I want to acknowledge her. She said a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, as we were talking about this, hey, we should have an event in conjunction with the report coming out. And I don't think she realized that meant she would have to plan the whole thing. And a big thanks to Yvonne Arenas, who supported all the work all the way through. Where is Yvonne? Oh, there he is over there. Including spending some very late nights getting the report to look like a report. And to the rest of the IRRPP staff, Ryan, Valoria, and others who make it all happen. Thanks also to the Chicago Community Trust for partnering with us today as part of their On the Table project. It was very auspicious this year that the focus on racial equity came up around, probably not accidentally, around the time of us trying to do this work. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming today and engaging in these important conversations. Our intent today is really to generate discussion about how we can begin, not just begin, but further our widespread work on confronting racial inequality in the city. The spirit of the event is to generate conversation among a group of really smart people. That was the criterion for inclusion, so there you go. Who care about and are working on racial equity in one realm or another, and to do some collective brainstorming. As you'll see in the program, there are two panels, one at the beginning of the day and one at the end. The question we put to the panelists was to open up a conversation, not to offer a final kind of answer to anything, about how we can imagine a more just Chicago. We asked panelists to share with us the work they're already doing about these challenges and to think out loud about the path forward. And after the panelists have spoken, the moderators will facilitate a conversation among the panelists. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome the first panelist up. The stairs are over there, and as you're coming up, I will introduce you. I can't do them justice if I were to give their full introductions. I would be taking the whole morning here to do this, so I'm going to offer a brief word about each of them while they come up, and the longer bios are in the program. Natalie Moore, who's going to be our moderator today, is a Southside reporter for WBEZ. She's also the author of a recently published The South Side, A Portrait of Chicago and American Segregation, which is a beautiful book describing not only segregation, but its really consequences on families. Tara Magner is the director of the Chicago Commitment at the MacArthur Foundation. She joined MacArthur in 2012 as a program officer in the Policy Research Program, focusing primarily on migration issues, after 2 stints working with Senator Patrick Leahy on the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary. Sylvia Puente is the executive director of the Latino Policy Forum. Through the forum, she works with more than 100 organizational leaders in the Chicago metropolitan region, and she's also the convener of the Illinois Latino Agenda. Beth Ritchie is a professor of sociology, African American studies, and criminology law and justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her scholarly and activist work focuses on the ways that race, ethnicity, and class affect women's experiences of violence and incarceration. And Dr. Robert Wynn is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Community-Based Practice, Director of the Cancer Center, and Professor of Medicine. I think the criterion for this panel is you have to have at least 3 jobs. He's a specialist in pulmonary and critical care medicine with an interest in using community-based research to help reduce health disparities. Please join me in welcoming them all here.
Good morning, everyone. So what we'll do is each of the panelists will give some remarks, and then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll leave time for the audience to ask some questions first. So I'll turn it over to you first.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be with you this morning. I also want to just take 1 second to congratulate the team that produced this report. The Sun-Times said it was lengthy, and it is, but it's an extraordinary compilation of data and statistics presented in a way that I think is staggering and stark and compelling, but miraculously is also incredibly accessible. And so compliments to the team, not just for the work they put into this, but the writing, which is clear and I think really will make it possible for many more people to absorb this information. I'll just give you a quick, just a quick overview of the MacArthur's work that touches in various ways on racial issues and in Chicago. It's an international and a national foundation and a local foundation. And so we have tried to look at issues. Our focus on Chicago was really to try to pursue a vision of a city that's integrated and connected, where the government institutions are effective and responsive, where prosperity is shared and assets are available to everyone. This report in particular focuses on unequal treatment of racial groups, in part on the criminal justice system, the cost of incarceration, the diversion of resources from schools, et cetera. And so I'll just focus on a few things MacArthur's working on. Our criminal justice program has a primary focus on reducing over-incarceration, and one of the jurisdictions in which it works is Cook County. So there's a great deal of effort there. Happy to go into that more detail if that's of interest. We also support independent media and investigative reporting, recognizing the very significant importance of that on so many issues, from education, crime, and so on. We have a program called Benefit Chicago, which is a partnership with the Chicago Community Trust and Vanguard, which is trying to steer more capital to the social sector. And that program just announced its first set of loans this week. A couple of them are focusing right in Chicago. One is to Garfield Produce, which is a hydroponic vegetable farm that provides local residents, particularly those who have previously been incarcerated, with high quality jobs and job skills. And Sweet Beginnings, I'm sure most of you know Sweet Beginnings, based in North Lawndale, produces honey-based products called Bee Love that are now sold at Whole Foods, Mariano's, and a variety of other retailers. Our work in Chicago has also focused on immigrant-serving organizations. Most recently, for the last few years, we've tried to help expand the capacity for legal service providers to screen immigrants who may not have status, to see whether there is any potential avenue to gaining status. And then in the last few months, we've focused on organizations responding to the executive orders issued by the new administration. Our Chicago team that focuses just Chicago, the Chicago Commitment, is a relatively new team, and we're in the process of developing a Chicago strategy. So stay tuned. We hope to have some more publicly available descriptions soon. But we know that this effort will support work to strengthen critical local organizations, to sustain the cultural sector. We have had a multi-decade commitment to arts and culture institutions in the city, to promote diverse leadership across the city, and then to contribute to collective endeavors. At the moment, that is largely focused on preventing gun violence in the city. And why don't I stop there and let others go?
Thank you.
I'm going to get right down to it because I only have 6 minutes, and that's all right with me because it only takes 6 minutes to say what I need to say. First of all, this slide, just take a second to look at. This has been generated by the West Side Total Collaborative Health and also from VCU. What you can see there is that for us, this concept of disparity is a significant driver for me for the catalyst for change. And as you can see, you have in the loop, you have, and you can talk about river forest and all the rest of that, but let's focus on the loop. You have an average life expectancy of 85, and in West Garfield Park, 60, 68, 69, depending on what you do with the numbers. And if we go south, sometimes the numbers even worse. So the issue is, for me, that this is not some sort of theoretical issue, but this is happening right now, only several miles away. And in fact, in some places in the United States, the disparity between life expectancy gets over 2 decades. Now, the truth of the matter is, in the time where we say we're the most proudest about our technology, we're talking about all the issues around our healthcare delivery systems, we're doing all this amazing things. In fact, the crazy part about it is the future isn't something in the past, the future is here. It's just woefully and disgustingly unevenly distributed. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there are technologies right now that people are thinking about on your cell phone. In fact, I was just at a conference with Eric Topol, who's a very famous cardiologist and actually thought leader in our country, and has published over 1,100 papers. He was able to actually diagnose his own hydronephrosis, that means large kidney and kidney stone, with his cell phone and a little adapter of an ultrasound. So I'm not talking something that's futuristic. I'm talking about something that's here. And while we're sitting in this room, what we're sort of thinking about is, why isn't that available to everybody? Second, he even has the ability now to actually, even better than cardiologists, be able to put your 2 little fingers on a little pad of your telephone, and not only does it take the EKG, but the EKG is better than what it does when you come see one of us, because we usually get back to you the next day. This EKG on your cell phone gives you not only the results, but breaks it down in real English and telling you what you have. The interesting thing is, as I looked at this, I started looking at, well, this is an issue in Chicago. So the life expectancy, United States is 78.9, but it actually dropped for the first time, despite our technologies. And interesting, my question was, that started off this whole quest of mine to actually try to address this issue, was name a low and middle income community that's either at life expectancy in the US or exceeded it. And I couldn't find one, period. In general, what we see is that we talk about all our technology, we talk about our advances, and almost like a little bit like redlining, and it only really is going to benefit some. So the thing that got me really most upset, and not to say that I am anti-technology, because God knows if we didn't actually have the heart cath, and PTCA to treat you with cardiovascular disease, right, that would be terrible. So believe me, it's not the technology that's actually doing a disservice, it's the people behind the technology. So let's just keep that straight. It's not that the development of technology is going to be bad, it's the fact that once the technology is developed, that the lack of access continues to increase disparities. Because one can increase right now, I just came in a conference where they're talking about this 85 and saying we should be able to, in some populations, be able to add an additional 7 years if this all works out. So think about that. So now we've gone from 85 to 92, and your West Garfield Park probably goes 68, 69, still stays the same. Technology has the ability to sort of increase disparities if we're not careful. Now, to address this issue, I sort of actually simply answered the question, well, maybe the model is to put another academic medical center like a Johns Hopkins or University of Chicago, boom, right down in Garfield Park. Turns out that that's not the answer. In fact, if you look at our most esteemed universities, our health centers, what you see is there are certainly amazing technology, amazing science, an amazing generation of knowledge, but the people who live 2 blocks away from that center typically are being sent somewhere else. That's not the answer. So then I thought, well, maybe all we need is just more clinics, and maybe we just need more clinics. Maybe we just need more CAT scans and all the rest of that. But the interesting thing is if the people don't trust, they don't go. So again, it's not the easy answer. So I had to turn somewhere else, and I'm gonna make this real quick. I made a case for a different healthcare model by sometimes just looking outside. So what I did was to simply, and this is one of our projects, we have something on the justice around big data. You don't get me started about our love for data, but then why can't I actually go to Barnett on the 27th ward and tell him anything about the health of his ward? So we're priding ourselves on our data. I mean, we are so, when you say big data, people, oh my God, big data, right? We've gotten into this craziness of big data leading to even bigger data that leads to bigger data, so much so that we've even lost perspective on what the data is supposed to do in the first place. And I know I got 2 minutes, so I'm gonna end this real quick. Right? The fact that we still talk about negligible populations and we can't measure them should be criminal in the 21st century. The fact that we have all these academic universities and we can't develop tools to measure smaller sample sizes, again, is criminal. So I'll end with this. Sometimes you just have to look outside to bring something inside. So the Cuba project for us was really to look at whether there were low or middle income countries that were under-resourced, that had a life expectancy either at or exceeding that of the United States. And the reality is Cuba is one example, but we have many. Now, what's the secret sauce in that? The secret sauce in that, and let me just give a shout out to Nikisha, because that's the VLA kids with one of the guys from the Ministry of Health who came here from Cuba. They will be back in the summer for about hopefully a 2 or 3 month stint with us to actually sit on the south side of Chicago and actually help in the west side of Chicago and help us think through about what we could do better. I know that takes an ounce of humility to sort of say, yeah, well, maybe we ain't got it all right, and maybe you're doing something better, so maybe you can help us. I know that's not the way of the United States, but it used to be at some point anyways. We do know that the social determinants are important, and so let me get to the last slide. The reality is I am going to be pushing for much more focus early on about the social determinants of health so that we know what the housing education is. Be pushing more for the recognizing that technology is good but limited, that the improved use of big data for actually local effects is meaningful, and we need to figure out how to do it as opposed to keep telling me that it's unstable and the data doesn't, and the end's too small. Shut up. We're talking about doing all these amazing things, putting man on moons and all this other stuff, and then we can't actually come up with some sort of concept to address this. Get out of here. I don't buy it. And we must address the social justice issue around the lack of access to big data for the people in communities and for the individual. And lastly, I'll leave you with, we at some point are going to have to acknowledge that the potential benefits to our own community can be gained from looking at other programs outside in other countries that have assets. And so I'll leave you essentially with that. Certainly reach the world, but touch our hood first. And then this is from a picture from Kathy Tosas-Welligan. That was one of our graduations. So anyways, I'll leave you with that and sort of say we got a lot of work to do, but this is the most exciting time in history, and we have a lot of work to get done. And I am actually cautiously optimistic, but ridiculous. That O on the optimism I have. So hopefully we'll share that with you.
Good morning. This is one of those days where it's not every day, but you feel proud to be at UIC. You know, this is one of those actualizing our mission as an urban public research university, and also an event that makes you proud to be associated with IRRPP. So thank you. I want to take us to a place, however, other than UIC, but not too far from here, to talk about the ways that few other places in the U.S. landscape illustrate racial disparities as profoundly as the criminal legal system. We only need to look over the wall of the Cook County Jail or find ourselves inside any office of probation or parole services in this city to see the obvious concentration of Black and brown people in the carceral spaces of the city. We could visit any courtroom where there are bail hearings this morning, go to any holding pen in a police station in Chicago and see the obvious pattern of racial disparity where Black and brown women, children, men held in confinement at astounding rates. The report documents this. This overrepresentation shows not just about life for the people who are in those cells, in those cages, but the web of law and policy and administrative practices that surround that, and the subsequent confinement of people in so-called correctional institutions. Again, profound illustration of racial injustice. I want to say that while I hope in our discussion we're going to focus on racial injustice, indeed that's what called us here, that our discussion also will take a more intersectional analysis to look also at how gender, sexuality, class, age, and other factors influence issues of racial injustice. So the IRRPP report clearly talks about the how despite the decrease in crime rates, this country, this city is still deeply committed to both the ideological and economic commitment to punishment through incapacitation, and that remains steadfast. And whether it trickles up from national policy to Chicago, or whether Chicago policy trickles down from national policy or up from local policy, we still see a profound commitment in this city through most social institutions to disenfranchising people through the use of crime, not because of crime, but through the use of crime and criminal justice, and it's affecting communities for generations. So at the most basic level, we see Black and brown people questioned, stopped, arrested, detained, charged, tried, or more likely forced to take a plea, found guilty, sentenced, incarcerated, and then, once released from confinement, unfairly burdened by state supervision. It's highly disproportionate. And it's uniquely destructive in communities of color. Racializing criminalization affects all spheres of life, all of the spheres that are talked about in the report, with some very important specific impacts on women and gender nonconforming people. So the focus often in this work is on the individuals who face the most serious consequences, the kind of cumulative effects that many scholars call civic death. Less obvious is the impact on families who suffer as well when their loved ones are held for long sentences in dangerous or obsolete facilities farther and farther away from the communities that they live in, where help and human services are basically non-existent. In fact, often health problems are created because of institutionalization. And relationships are shattered, neighborhoods are weakened, communities are depleted from the people who they need, both the human resources, but also when resources are diverted, as that slide that Amanda showed, resources are diverted from communities to the economic project that we call the prison industrial complex and the political project that we call the prison nation. Sheer numbers are important to look at. It's also important to look beyond the sheer numbers. When you start reading the report, and if you start with the justice section of the report, you'll quickly realize that the economic, political, and social, educational, health conditions that Black and brown people, especially those in low-income neighborhoods, are so concentrated that criminal justice or criminal legal policies becomes the lens to understand all of those other issues. Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore calls this organized abandonment, the way that we leave communities vulnerable to this insidious apparatus of racially motivated carceral processes. These are things like new laws, aggressive policing strategies, executive orders, fewer prevention or diversion programs, an underfunded public defender's office, as well as the broader trends like harsh school discipline, changes in administrative policies that criminalize violations of public assistance, for example, the creation of protocols that stiffen penalties for norm-violating behaviors related to sexuality. These are just examples. A closer look at this law and order agenda that permeates outside of, as well as inside of so-called correctional institutions, has us calling attention to things like the renewed commitment to the war on drugs, things like broken windows policing. And when we look at the profound impact of criminalization, I do want to just pause for a moment to say the good news is we can see some progress. There have been several key initiatives that make me know that we can make change. We can make different kinds of decisions. The work against wrongful convictions, for example. The work around justice for torture survivors. The elimination of juvenile life without the possibility of parole. The economic analyses that are beginning to influence how legislators make decisions about the economic waste that comes from long-term incarceration, especially for low-level drug offenders. That's noteworthy, not only because of the particular effects that will have, but also because it means we can do something different. I think the growing concern about police excessive use of force, restoring voting rights for some citizens, all of these are examples of change. However, we also have to understand that the work that led to that change was not just work around criminal legal reform, it was racial justice work, right? It framed the problem of the criminal legal system from a racial justice lens, indeed a gender justice lens as well, a class justice lens, and that's, I think, what the report offers us. I also want to just mention quickly that we have to pay particular attention to the way that criminal justice or legal reform is going to influence what we are anticipating, it's not even anticipation, what is happening right now in terms of a new administration's recommitment to aggressive, harsh criminal legal policy. Renewed commitment to stop and frisk, obviously the immigration policies, the control of sexual freedom, criminalization of things like HIV, a reinvestment in militarized law enforcement, things like Blue Lives Matter laws, which will turn any injury that happens to a police officer in the course of their routine business into a hate crime toward police officers. We make no mistake, this current Justice Department under its new leadership is deeply committed to moving forward, by moving backward, if you will, to an authoritarian, punitive carceral state that will have the kind of power like we have almost never seen, at least never seen recently in its most vile sense. Its commitment to bringing the criminal legal system to an agenda of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, etc. And I think we need to be vigilant about understanding the very real impact that we're going to feel. Let me just say a few things in concluding. The report talks about some important points. It talks about the media-driven narrative about violence in Chicago. I think we need to understand that media-driven narrative and all of the people who have latched onto it signifies a way to create racialized fear in order to support the agenda of a new commitment to a law and order agenda that will have serious impact on Black and Latino people. That's why we can say that despite the crime rate decreasing, we will increase incarceration in this country, the buildup of a prison nation, and it will include all kinds of public policy that will seep into most social institutions. It's clear that by focusing on violence as a crime, instead of looking at the ways that we have diverted resources from those communities who are most disadvantaged, so communities don't have the opportunity to respond to the violence, instead the state responds by incarceration, is the clear path of diverting resources from local, state, and federal initiatives, and instead normalizing the need to put people in cages, people who can't vote, people who don't get counted in census, people who live in neighborhoods where their schools are closing, etc. And I guess the last thing I'll say, that I know we'll have lots of discussion about, is that we can't ever conclude a discussion about the criminal legal system without focusing on policing and the attention to policing and state-sanctioned violence. And so this is where the point about excessive use of force with impunity and the relationship between state violence, state-sanctioned violence, and violence that's happening in communities that has sort of permeated the narrative as if it's the only kind of violence is so important. I think we're obligated to kind of think about this report not only in the data that it gives us about racial justice, but what it means more broadly about social justice, and realize that until we do that, until we realize that the various spheres that the report covers are really robbing us of the people from our communities who we need. We need them as university students, we need them as workers in organizations, we need them as activists, as think tank leaders, as people providing research. Until we bring them home to be part of what the struggle is, not only do we need to worry about their freedom, but we need to worry also about how our resources are depleted and in fact what our legitimacy can't look like without their involvement. So thank you.
Good morning, how's everybody doing? Good to see you all. So I'm Sylvia Puente, I'm the Executive Director of the Latino Policy Forum. So we are a small organization that works to inform, influence, and lead on the issues of early education, housing, immigration, and strengthening leadership as building blocks for advancement for the Latino community and for society. And I always like to say that by advancing Latinos, we advance our shared future, because I think that the big frame as we think about this broader issue of equity is for the Latino community, at least, there is what I'm beginning to see as a bifurcation of opportunity, and that there is a cohort of the Latino community that is doing really well. Nearly 30% of households earning over $70,000, $75,000 a year. And that cohort is increasing. But at the same time, we have a cohort of the community that is in poverty, and poverty is now 1 out of every 5 families, almost 1 out of every 3 children. We have the largest number of low-income children in the state, despite being 17% of the state's population. So we have this bifurcation of inequality that's occurring within the Latino community, as well as, I think, on all the other dimensions that this report suggests. So to address some of those issues, the forum really has a robust agenda, and I like to say that we are not a think tank, we are a do tank. And some of the ways that we are doing that and addressing some of the inequality that we see and I'll give a couple of examples from each of our issue areas. In the area of education, for example, how many of you know about the Every Student Succeed Act? It is the new federal legislation that replaces No Child Left Behind, which will begin to be implemented this fall in the state of Illinois. But to get ready for that, the state had to submit its plan to the federal government just last month. And to get ready for that, we literally engaged for a year in no less than about 10 different coalitions, stakeholder groups, Illinois State Board of Education, national groups, to say, how do we shape the state's plan to guide the next generation of education in the state of Illinois? And this is particularly exacerbated because the federal government now requires that of the 5 criteria that all schools and states need to report on, which are accountability and testing and all the things that we would normally think about. But for the first time, we now have to measure the progress of English language learners in learning English. So to make a long story short, after a year of hard work, I'm pleased to say that the Illinois State Board of Education adopted 9 out of 11 of the Latino Policy Forum's recommendations that we developed with broad stakeholder input. We had a meeting where we had 200 community leaders come and say to us what they thought was important about measuring that progress. And they adopted, and then numerous dialogues and conversations, and those recommendations were adopted almost word for word. So we will be able to measure the progress of English language learners not only while they're in the program, but what does it mean when they're finished, throughout their education. We go down to having to measure, report on this when there are at least 20 students in a school, which means that about 1/3 of the schools across the state of Illinois are going to have to be paying attention to how well these children are doing. And they can no longer be marginalized because their test results don't really count and they're not part of the overall pool. As another example, I think we all know that the state is very invested in a school funding reform bill that may or may not be making progress in Springfield as we speak. This is perhaps one of the very few bright spots in the budget, and that there is at least the attempt to have additional resources for education overall in the state's budget. The Latino Policy Forum has worked very hard to make sure that that language in that bill, especially as it impacts English language learners, and the bill would call for additional resources for bilingual students, that those resources are additive and not supplanted. And literally this means negotiating with all the lawmakers and the bill sponsors. What does that language actually look like to make sure that students can have the resources that they need on this issue? As well as our overall testimony and just the overall funding inequality, which disproportionately impacts low-income Latino children in suburban school districts where the majority of school children now reside. In the area of housing, and this is an issue that I think is very, very interesting because we've had ongoing conversations with the CHA, and this is an issue where, to put it on the table, the inequality that exists in access to public housing between the African American and the Latino community, when all communities are struggling. We saw the amount of rent burdenship that we saw there and the dramatic impacts of the foreclosure crisis. Yet, if we were to have equity, about 25% of those in CHA should be, in CHA public housing should be Latino. It's only 10%. And that's really stymied, and it only got to be 10% after our predecessor organization sued about 20 years ago, and we moved the needle from 2% to 10%. So we are in ongoing conversations and dialogue with CHA and city officials about how can we move this needle to open up access so that all those who are in need of affordable housing can access it. Of course, in the area of immigration, our third policy focus area, there is just, I was really struck by your comment on the racialization of fear, because I think that's certainly something that is occurring now, obviously, with the new administration in terms of the racialization of fear with respect to immigrant communities, the launch of this new initiative that the federal government called Voices, which is supposedly to protect victims of crimes committed by immigrants, and now asking all municipalities to report those crimes on a regular basis. Our role of that is in ensuring that organizations have the information they need on this ever-changing immigration policy. And going further than that, and to do that, we've launched something that we've called Mi Impacto. So I'll leave a few of these, but a place where you can, on the Latino Policy Forum website, where you can get real news. You can get links to the national organizations, because we have limited capacity, that are following what's happening, and the position statements that we're encouraging people to sign on to. But in addition to that, going further, we're actually beginning to look at the intersection of immigration, where we have some expertise, and early education, where we have some expertise. And what is the impact of this climate of fear and trauma on children, especially children that are aged birth to 3, and their families? How do we make sure they have the resources, the information, the questions to ask to address the fear and the trauma? And then how do we get real when emergency plans now means that you really have to have an emergency plan that say who is guardian for your child if something were to happen? So how do we make sure that organizations have that research and the information and the resources they need to be able to make informed decisions? The fourth bucket, I've talked about education, housing, immigration. Our fourth bucket is really in terms of how do we think about strengthening leadership. And a couple of examples there. You can't do any of this work, as this report indicates, I think, unless you have a baseline of data. And the forum's basic premise to everything we do is, what is the measure, what is the gap of equality or inequality, and then how do we close it? So a couple of things that we've done legislatively is that we really led on a bill that now requires the state of Illinois to report on the race, ethnicity, gender, disability status of everyone who's appointed to a board and commission. Boards and commissions have a lot of influence, they make a lot of decisions, they make a lot of recommendations. They're supposed to be representative of the people. That legislation was passed, and just recently passed, and our current governor would have been the first governor to have to issue that report. We had to nudge him a little bit and ask Maldiv to sue because they refused to comply. And now that the first report was just issued late last year. Similarly, it's really hard to measure what the gap of equality or inequality is when we don't know who's getting served. It's sort of hard for me to believe, but the Illinois Department of Human Services, which is the largest grantor even in this climate of grants to organizations that work on serving the community, we know that only 5% of grants from that organization go to Latino serving organizations, even though we're 17% of the population. And the response has always been, but other organizations who aren't primarily Latino serving serve the Latino community. And our response has always been, well, yes, then how many? And there is no way to count. So we are moving efforts with a piece of legislation that would require the Illinois Department of Human Services to have a consistent way of cataloging, counting, documenting who is providing services by race, ethnicity, gender, and disability, and language status. So we hope that we'll have some positive results on that by the end of the session. And then the last initiative that I'll highlight in terms of what we're doing as we think about all the various dimensions of this complex issue of social inequality is that we've had a long-standing leadership program that is primarily focused on training leaders who work in Latino serving organizations. And after 6 years of doing that, training 150 leaders, 60 organizations, we said, do we continue to do this? But sort of looking at the environment of where we're at and feeling where I think this amazing dialogue that we're having across the city so much now on racial inequality, we're concluding, we designed, launched, recruited, did outreach, and we are now concluding the first class of our Multicultural Leadership Academy. And this inaugural class has been focused on bringing together Latino and African American leaders who work in communities across the city of Chicago. It has been amazing. They have gone beyond my wildest expectations. But having done this work for so many years, I can literally count, maybe now on both hands, the intentional efforts that happen across the city between African American and Latino communities. I think they happen much more at the neighborhood level between adjacent communities, but rarely at the citywide level. So this transformational leadership program, and it truly has been transformational, and I could talk about it at length if you'd like to know more, but we have invested in this network of 23 Black and brown leaders who are going to be bonded for the rest of their civic life in Chicago, who are already connecting and partnering in ways we couldn't have dreamed of, but concretely are working out on projects of social, community, and policy change. And the biggest group thing that they wanted to focus on initially is, yeah, we say we should all be working together, and here's an issue and how do we come to work together on this issue, but we don't even know each other, and we don't even talk to each other. So they are piloting dialogues around the city. They've already done 3, where they're bringing Black and brown youth, leaders, neighbors together to have a conversation on what do we know and what do we understand about each other's communities. Super excited about what that means for our city and for our future. So as we think about this gap of equality and inequality and how we close it, I find that oftentimes, if the forum is not asking the question, if we're not putting out what the measure of equality or inequality is on any of these issues, no one is. And if we're not asking the question, and if we're not advocating on the question, we can never get to closing it. So I think it's so fascinating that across the city, in so many different forums and dialogues, the trust, other foundations, we're asking ourselves this question about how do we address the racial inequality that exists in our city. And some of you have heard me say this, but as Latino Policy Forum, where I have been now for 8 years, I cannot tell you the number of times I have had to explain to funders or to others who say to me, well, we don't fund based on race or ethnicity. And I said, well, I'm not asking for funding for race and ethnicity, but I need you to understand that the inequality is a function of race and ethnicity. And it's not just that inequality, it exists in and of itself in isolation in terms of access to poor schools. And that has been a tremendous effort of issue education in order to even be able to get the resources to do the work that we do. And when you exacerbate that intersection of inequality based on the issue by race and ethnicity, and then you add the component of segregation and the segregated communities that we live in, it's even more compounded. I do not personally think that desegregation is the issue, because I think there is a lot of economic vitality, ethnic pride, and cohesion that comes from living in ethnic enclaves. I think what we must recognize and acknowledge is that the fundamental here is the disinvestment that we have had in investing in communities of color historically in Chicago and across the region. And so how we look at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and where communities live is, I think, critically important, which becomes more compounded in the case of the Latino community when you add on the issues of language, immigration status, and culture. So our priorities can be on any of these issues that we've talked about today. In terms of, I think, what is needed, while I am certainly heartened by the levels of civic engagement that we're seeing, the marches, the demonstrations across the city and across the nation, I'm a pragmatic person above all else. And I say, we wouldn't be here if many of those people protesting had voted. I'm just saying. So it is about protest politics, but how do we move protest politics to civic engagement, to being advocates, and also to the ballot box? To do that, though, we can have this amazing conversation that we can talk about today. We can have the amazing conversation we're going to have next about what can be done. But I ask you, who's going to do the doing? And where are the resources going to come for the doing? The Latino Policy Forum is a fairly unique organization. We were fortunate to have Boston Consulting Group to do strategic planning for us last year. There's only 11 organizations that undertake policy work for the Latino community in the States, across the country. So there are not a lot of organizations like this, which doesn't mean that there are other ways of doing. But that doing means that we need to have the analysis. We need to have the analysis of that inequality, and we need to have the analysis of what that looks like, especially at levels of government, which have a responsibility for equity to address all of these issues. But for too often are making decisions on where resources go without accountability, without a measure or decision criteria of equity. So we need the analysis. We need that analysis at a neighborhood level. We need the advocates, because we need those that are working to facilitate that change. We need to make sure that there are goals for equity in every government agency and outside of government as well. What does that goal for equality look like? And how do we have transparency and accountability of that? And just one concrete example of that. You may know that when CPS was dealing with its budget crisis a couple of months ago, they were making cuts to certain schools. It was sometimes it had to do the analysis that showed that those cuts were disproportionately focusing on low-income Latino schools. I would have loved to have been able to do that analysis at the Latino Policy Forum. I don't have the resources, I don't have the investment of resources to be able to do that kind of analysis on an ongoing basis. Because so much of that decision-making is going on that continues to disinvest in our communities with no one is looking. And if no one is looking, we're going to continue to see the level of inequality that we continue to see in our city and our state.
So I'm just going to jump right into an issue that is bugging me. Through my work at BEZ, I get to cover a lot of these issues, and with my latest book, I've been able to talk about these issues publicly for the past year. And Rob, like you, I do have this big O optimistic, and people are surprised. And the reason why, almost every talk I give, I quote Lisa Lee and what her radical vision for what art can mean for this city. And there are a number of you who I cite in my footnotes. And so I think the general public that's starting to understand these issues, I tell them all the time, is that there are people who are studying these issues, who are working on these issues, from Chicago State to Northwestern. There are solutions out there. These issues seem so intractable because if you look at it just racial justice without putting into buckets. Like, how do we look at food? How do we look at health? How do we look at youth programs? All of those things. And so I guess my question to you all and to this panel is to think about, like, what does it take to move the needle on these issues? And I also maybe had this epiphany recently. There's overlap in my personal and professional life. And I realized that my circle includes a lot of people like you, artists, academics, activists, and then I have the people I grew up with who may overlap with that too. And recently, I met some policy people at an event, and I was like, I don't know these policy people who actually work for the city. The policy people I know work at institutions. And the policy people at the city and the county level, I don't think are working on these issues. So I could be wrong. But I was like, oh, I maybe these people aren't talking to these people, or maybe I don't know the dynamics about public policy work and where you decide to ply your trade. So all this is a long-winded way of saying there are solutions out there, there are ideas, there are concrete examples. How do we get government to buy in to these issues, to these solutions, and start adapting them?
I mean, I think part of it is really focusing on the civic leadership across the city, and I mean that at every level, at the community level, at the community-based organization level, city government, county government, et cetera. And there are any number of very excellent programs focusing on leadership development in the city, but one thing we're trying to figure out at MacArthur is, do these individual programs need more resources to do what they do better, or expand the number of people that can benefit from the programs? Or do we need to make sure all of these programs are intersecting with one another, because each has a slightly different audience of applicants, right? So if the University of Chicago's program is focused on government and nonprofit leaders, that's a wonderful thing, because those might be the people who don't often get to participate in leadership programs. But how do we make sure that those people are connected to the private sector leaders and the city and county government leaders, so that we're not ending up with silos, right? How do we have more people graduating from programs like the one Sylvia just described, not just being highly engaged with one another across communities, but running for office and taking jobs in agencies where they are implementing policy and making decisions every day about what those policies mean at a local level. So those are a few things we've been thinking about, hope to maybe identify what some of the gaps are and try to bring resources to them.
I guess I would just add that, the systems change piece and the public policy piece is, I think, obviously where we're going to have the most dramatic impact. The Civic Leadership Academy is probably the leadership program that's most poised to do that, because it's bringing nonprofit leaders in with government leaders to begin to have the conversation. But I think the bigger challenge and the bigger issue is that people do not understand public policy. Many funders don't want to fund public policy, and it's complicated and time consuming, right? So how do we have the resource investment that's required to really be able to look at these issues in depth, to really think about what the systematic levers of change are? And then how do we move beyond, as one small example, a lot of aldermen are now doing participatory budgeting, and they're having their local communities vote on where do they allocate their local dollars. That's great, right? But how do we have that level of accountability and decision criteria for investment for every city dollar and every county dollar that's spent across every department and every organization? And how do we even do that at the level of the state? Because we're not doing that now. People are saying, well, I want funding for this and I want funding for that, but there's no overall decision criteria that really looks at how do we close these gaps of inequality, as you just mentioned. And it's not that we don't know how, right? But the biggest investment is that we can have all, I appreciate this report and everyone that's here, but how do you continue to fund the capacity of the stakeholders and the actors who are committed to making that change? And then how do you continue to train others so that they can understand how you facilitate public policy change as well?
So I want to add the role of activism in the discussion because I guess I'm not convinced that we will government our way out of some of these problems. Because in many ways the government is the problem. So I, today, I might feel differently tomorrow. I think that there is a role for state intervention in many of the problems that we're facing. Other times I've said there is no role for the state because the state that my world gets me into has created these problems. But today I'll say there is a role for the state, and the role that the state plays has to be informed by smart public policy. And smart public policy, I think, has to be informed by grassroots activism. And I think that's a gap that we haven't really figured out how to have. So it's not just the silos of issues. We work on schools or jobs or housing or incarceration. I mean, that's one way that the silos play out. But we also, when we're working on in one of those silos, we work from different perspectives, and we often feel like the enemy is the policy advocate when I'm the activist, or, so that there's not kind of it's a sort of approach that is based on a shared analysis of what the common enemy is or what the root cause is, however we might frame it, and figure out what's the role of where do we protest, when do we have a meeting, when do we pull together a think tank, when do we write legislation. And I think when we don't do that, we both not only are less effective, but we often create problems for each other. And so I think the invitation in some ways from the report is to think about how do we invite activism based on a radical analysis of injustice into the discussion, both in producing data but also responding to the kind of data that's presented in the report.
I'll keep my comments brief, but I'm reminded that in the time when we were in our heyday and the country was actually not in the red, in the black, that in Bedford-Stuyvesant there were still problems around these issues. South side of Chicago, there were still problems around these issues. So I don't know if the issue is when money flows aplenty, that all of a sudden we get rid of the issues around equity. So it's beyond that. In my world, particularly when I was doing as an admissions dean, people would say, well, we can't recruit because, we don't have the money. But I'm like, well, when we did have the money, what was the issue then? Right? So I think that we have to get beyond that and also add the concept in an age of data. We, the people, not just the owners we had this hallowed thing that the academicians and the Illinois Department of Health, these were the holy people, the data, but that data is collected on us. We have not yet had that conversation about the dissemination of data and what kind of data goes back to our community. In fact, we think that, what are they going to do with it? They're not going to know it. I mean, we've had this concept of deficit thinking around our communities for now decades that I'm just tired. The truth of the matter is, if we're in an age of data, if we're in an age of activism, you can do a whole lot of activism, but the reality is, if I'm driving and I'm trying to get somewhere, I can have a car with a whole tank of gas, but if I don't know where I'm going, it still's not going to make a difference. And if I don't know how to get there, we should be demanding, in some ways, and educating and re-engaging our communities in their own agency, right? And in fact, what we've been doing is, in some ways, being, and I'm not going to say patronistic, because I would never say that, because I'm in public, I would never say that. But there is an age of what is an academic institution, and particularly a state academic institution's responsibility in engaging our communities and enhancing and allowing those communities to actually be awesome. This bi-directional kind of concept, which we learn from, just like assets, and we learn with. But again, these conversations, I think, are going to be the genesis and the germination of how we actually get there. But it is sad to say that we have populations right now where we cannot measure anything because they're too small. Or they say to us, well, we can't tell you about your ward data. And I say, well, why not? Well, there's 100,000 reasons, but you tell me that I can actually now look and tell you who's going into Hopkins, who's not by the block. It's bull. We have data data is a social justice issue, and in reality is for me, my number one goal is to recognize that every blood that gets drawn now, everything that's in an EHR system that actually comes to a hospital is big data being collected on you. And as being part of the precision medicine movement, that we're actually going to now be drawing your DNA data, that's going to be on you. The question is, how do we disseminate the data back to the people and at least trust that that conversation may actually help us guide to where we need to go?
I want to ask one last thing. Describe what a just Chicago looks like.
Come on, that's awesome.
So I'll start, because I mean, it's a lot of things. It's one where we divest from militarized police and reinvest in communities, where we invite communities to be part of creating the solutions to the problems that they're facing. We, in the meantime, respond to the harm in the best way that we can, that's equitable by providing access, but we don't assume that responding to the harm is enough to prevent the next harm from happening. So those are two things that it would look like.
The quick one for me is, you see that number with the health disparity kind of numbers about life expectancy. The reality is, I wouldn't know we'll be moving the needle, but it may not go from 68 to 78, but when it's from 68 to 75, 68 to sort of creeping up, and that the technologies and all the rest of these other things and the access that when someone gets sick, the only answer isn't just, I have to take 3 buses and a train to get to an ER, right? That when we talk about violence, quote, that the violence issue isn't just an event anymore, where you get shot and then that's it. It's what actually happens, just like in cancer survivorship. What is the survivorship of that person, the perpetrator, everybody else in that community that they're going back to, so that we're actually having wraparound services for those folks, not only about education, but about job opportunities and everything else. That's when, beyond just the PTSD, because we do really well with PTSD, but beyond the PTSD, I will know that we're successful when that actually is increasing and that life expectancy is getting better.
All right, well, ditto and ditto, but just to add another point, I think, I don't want to bring us down, but I recently saw research from about a year ago that showed in the United States, white people think that racism against white people is increasing,
Yes.
right? And white people, generally speaking, tend to see progress among others as a zero-sum game that must harm the white population if others are moving up. So this is a mindset, I think, that we can't ignore as we try to address these issues. And so I think for me, part of this challenge and part of the work we have to do is find some ways of ensuring that the white folks in Chicago start to appreciate the way that all of the data in this report, every page of it, every statistic in it also affects them in ways that they should care about and take action about. And maybe the way to start is with the taxpayer dollars they're spending that aren't going to schools, that are going to incarceration. All of the diversion of funds to pay settlements for police brutality, right? I think that anyone in the city should and needs to care about that. That's not enough, but I'm trying to think about what are the ways in which we can really engage the people in the city that have the luxury of not having to think about all of this every day and not having to pay the very personal human tax that others in the city are paying.
Well, obviously, it's a very big question, but every child, every family, every person can live free of violence and has equitable access and opportunity to the resources they need for their education, their wealth, and their happiness. And concretely, when we look at schools, that every child everywhere in the state of Illinois, that we're not fighting about, it's astounding to me that we're fighting, that when we had budget cuts in education, we disproportionately hurt poor schools at the expense of wealthy schools. And some of you have seen some of the recent stories about students from inner city Chicago schools going to Wilmette and to the Niles schools. I mean, what does equity look like is when we would not have that wide disparity and gap, and then still expect students to be able to compete competitively for economic opportunity in the society.
I
I just wanted to add for me, just really quick, there's two basic things, fundamental things that aren't happening. One is access to food, good food. We call these things food deserts, and not food deserts, they're food swamps. It's not food deserts when you have no access, right? There's no food. But Twinkies, White Castle, all of that, that's not good, right? So a win for me is when there will actually be better access to fresh vegetables, foods, that is not sort of in a, quote, 3-4 mile distance, because sometimes you're walking, you see people walking in the car in the middle of winter, people say, well, it's only 2 miles away. Well, it's only if you have a car, right? Then it's a short shot, right? So when we actually make access of foods a priority, that's gonna be helpful. And the last thing I have to say is this concept about, we talk about childhood obesity, and then we talk about the health, and you know what, the truth of the matter is one basic principle is exercise. Some of our kids can't even get basic exercise anymore. Most of the programs have been closed down. And back in the day, at least I could play stickball. I don't know if they play stickball here, but anyways, flag football or whatever we would actually do out there. The reality is you see less and less kids being able to play, right? And so we're now double jeopardizing them, right? With the violence, they have bad food, they can't even go outside and play, right? And so then we talk about, well, let's go to the Y. But most of those programs are gone. The programs that would actually get you interested in playing baseball or football or any of these other things, those are too gone. So the access to just a basic principle, what I think is, again, a social justice issue, just the freaking exercise is also something that if it's addressed with there's more Ys and all the rest of that, I will be happy with the food and exercise. I will just take those two in the context of starting off.
If there's anyone who has, we have time for one burning question.
While they're going to the mic, can I also just say what I said when I started again, that racial justice cannot be separated from other forms of justice, gender justice and other economic justice and other intersectional issues.
So my question, back to your question, Natalie, about how do we get government to buy into this perspective, and I would like to challenge the panel. I heard different views here about segregation as the problem. We know that there are these life expectancy disparities. We know there are these neighborhood disparities. Sylvia mentioned the issue is not segregation, but equalizing investment in our communities. And yet, in a sense, there's collusion to keep our communities segregated that's documented in the book American Apartheid, that both white politicians and politicians of color benefit from having single race districts, and that perpetuates these communities of disparities. And I just wonder, how are we going to see change if we don't have political consensus at the left about whether segregation is good or bad?
The forum has worked a lot on redistricting, and sometimes at our peril, because I've got to get anything done, I've got to work with our Latino caucus in Springfield. At the same time, we've been part of Independent Maps, and I've been part of the leadership of that group in saying we need to restructure how we come up with political districts. So the same way that I would say that I don't think segregation is a problem, I don't think that having political districts that, especially, and not in this state, maybe not true in other states, but in this state, having political districts that have high concentrations of Latinos, African Americans, or others is the issue either. It really does come back, I think, again, to where is the resource investment, and how do we address decades, and in this case, even a century of disinvestment in our political districts and in our communities and in our neighborhoods. So I don't know that we'll ever get to consensus, right? But I do believe that I firmly believe the issue is really about how we have chosen to distribute our resources. Oftentimes, what we're seeing certainly in school funding now, this issue of not being aware of racial equity has really created an apartheid system, right, where we're actually investing more in majority white schools than we are in majority Latino and African American schools.
Just quickly, just keep my comments brief. I think it's beyond your issue around race. I think that there is a silent and not so silent war on class. And so the reality is for us, someone in Beattyville, Kentucky, which the life expectancy there actually is around 64, total white area, right, or some parts of Southern Illinois, that there is this bamboozlement now of part of this concept of fear that is now allowing us to go to sleep at the wheel, that this is a class issue. And so if the conversation can be elevated in the context of class, you get, you don't get Fred Hampton like, but to give Fred Hampton like, right? Fred Hampton actually said power to the people, and he meant that. To Black, brown, and others. In fact, he was the one that even had bikers and other people there, right? So in the spirit of Fred Hampton, right? This is an issue around class that we are not talking about and that we have been shamefully silent on. So if we can bring that conversation together, I think we can actually start maybe galvanizing more parties than we have in the past.
I agree with both of those 2 points, and I want to raise 2 others that I think are embedded in your question. One is, what is the cost of desegregation to communities of color? And second, what happens when we don't have consensus on the left? Be it about segregation or anything else, and so who decides, and what we do with that lack of consensus on the left, while people who are not on the left, both on the right and not on the left, because there's also the other people, what are they doing in the meantime while we don't have consensus on the left?
So I guess since I brought us down with my last comment, I'll try to offer something hopeful. I do think that we are seeing a great deal more community-led, civic-led, individual-led, ethnic, racial, other group-led movements to come together that, Sylvia talked about her organization's shift from a Latino leadership program to an African American and Latinoship partnership. United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations has been at this for 15, 17 years across neighborhoods, racial groups, ethnic groups, people with disabilities, and able-bodied. And there's a truth and racial healing transformation process underway with many of these same leaders from the same movements coming together. Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability is a community-led effort to interact with the police around how the police interacts with all of us, right? So there are a lot of efforts underway that are people organically on their own saying, we want to work together. We're tired of our leaders dividing and conquering us. So they'll go together to the Latino caucus and the Black caucus and say, don't separate us on this issue. We are united. And I feel like that is, has been underway for some time, but has obviously been galvanized over events in our nation in the last few years and the last few months.
I'm Alamo Convening, and I'm from the UI Cancer Center. My request is, this is an incredible conference, incredible panel, and we have so many organizations. We have people who are in political offices, academia, community. We all hold data. I would really love to see a summit like this where we bring our data and we begin to look at all of the assets that we hold and we begin to share, which I think can get to the lack of resources that we all compete for. And then we can start to find patterns that begin to address the inequalities that we all are very interested in trying to conquer. So that's my request. Thank you so much.
The esteemed folks on this panel have short bios that are pages long. So I'm going to do very brief introductions. There are longer bios on the back of your programs, but to suffice it to say, it's a very esteemed group. I will start introducing them, but they can start moseying up here, up the stairs on the left, and have a seat. Dear friend and colleague Barbara Ransby is our moderator this afternoon. She's the director of the Social Justice Initiative and professor of Gender and Women's Studies, History, and African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is an historian, activist, and author, and was recently elected to be president of the National Women's Studies Association. Derek Clifton is a native of Chicago. He's an independent journalist and communications consultant who is committed to writing and reporting that engenders dialogue at the intersection of identity, culture, and politics, and his work has appeared in a long list of important venues. Rick Estrada is the president and CEO of Metropolitan Family Services. He has nearly 3 decades of leadership experience in human services, philanthropy, and government in the city. Grace Ho has been the president of the Woods Fund, Chicago, since February 2012. Her career has been dedicated to systems change improvement through public policy development and implementation. social services provision, community organizing and engagement, and now philanthropy. And finally, Jesus Churi Garcia is the Cook County Commissioner for the 7th District. He is a progressive leader who has fought to improve the lives of all Chicagoans and has received many distinctions for his tireless advocacy of social justice. He, I have to mention, earned a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in urban planning here from UIC. So proud, we are very proud to have him as an alumni. I don't know how he feels about it, but good, excellent. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Okay, so I'm really honored to be moderating this panel. I'll be an active moderator, which doesn't mean I'm not going to dip into your time.
My name is Grace Ho, and I'm president of Woods Fund Chicago. And so to kind of piggyback on what Barbara said, 3 out of the other 4 panelists here are actually board members, which means I report to them.
We're going to recruit Derek after this.
So this is a high intensity panel for me. So Woods Fund Chicago is a private grant making foundation that funds nonprofit organizations to fight the brutality of structural racism and poverty in Chicago through community organizing and public policy advocacy. You know, and one of the benefits of working at Woods Fund and coming when I did was that in 2008, the board, Beth Ritchie was there at the time, under the leadership of Deborah Harrington, who was in my seat at the time, established racial equity as a lens for the foundation. So that's been 11 years. And so when I came in 2012, there was work that had to be done and to be continued along the journey of what it means to be a racial equity foundation, what does it mean to be a foundation that has racial equity as one of its core tenets. So, you know, this conversation is being stimulated by the report that UIC Institute has done. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that work and a little bit of work about the work of Woods Fund within the time allocation that I have. And so the 3 words that really, I think, stood out to me, and I think purposely in the report, were pervasive, persistent, and consequential, right? And so if you talk about race and issues of racial equity, racial justice in our region, and actually across the country, those are so resounding. And I actually also want to start off by commending all the authors and the contributors to this report, and really the idea of actually creating a compendium of information and data, right, across issues on this important issue before us. And I think it highlights in many ways that this issue of racial equity is not an education thing, it's not a housing thing, it's not a criminal justice thing. It actually cuts across every issue that you could possibly slice. And so from the viewpoint of a foundation, right, who actually doesn't work on specific program areas, it kind of affirms our philosophy in terms of allowing our grantees to determine what they want to work on through the leadership of the leaders that they have on the ground, right? So they will come to us and really talk about the authentic engagement of folks on the ground, and then say to us, we want to work on immigration reform or immigrant rights or criminal justice. And it's through that process that we, and I talked about this last night, so I apologize for the folks who saw the panel last night, that there's a little bit of giving away, we like to think, a little bit of philanthropic privilege, right, that we have as foundation folks. And so other pieces that really stood out to me in the narrative in the report was acknowledging the long collective racial history of our region and the intentionality, right, of policies that are actually, we are continuing to feel the effects of it. You know, and as I read every page, it was like heavier and heavier and heavier in terms of the problem that is actually staring down at us as people who are in positions to potentially take a bite out of what's happening. And I think, though, what was also clear was that we've seen this data before in bits and pieces, and that the evidence proves that inequities are alive and well, and in fact, they are thriving, right? And so there's a burden on those of us who have social justice and our mission to figure out what the solutions are. But I think in terms of figuring out where we go from here, it's really, and there was some of that discussion at our table, is like, how do we reach the folks who are not in the choir, who are not in the church, who are not a part of the congregation, to begin kind of feeling the weight of this. And so Metropolitan Planning Council did a pretty, I think, remarkable job with their cost of segregation in terms of monetizing what segregation has done to our region and to the detriment of all of us who live in this area. But I think it's important to figure out how we can reach out beyond who feel comfortable talking about the issue of race, who are skeptical or ignorant, right, to disabuse them that these issues don't matter. And so there are 5 questions that we were asked to really cover really broadly, but I want to recognize that I am a foundation person, right? So my job is, at the end of the day, very simply to provide resources to nonprofit organizations on the ground, to do work that resonates with their community and that is also in alignment with what we do. So I'm going to talk really quickly about Woods Fund. So when you walk into the door of Woods Fund Chicago, you'll see a framed copy of a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. And it says, "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstance of economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary." Right? And so that was there long before I joined Woods Fund, but it reminds us that, again, we have philanthropic privilege in the foundation community. That many of our assets, in fact, were probably built upon economic injustice and racial injustice. And that we need to support organizations and solutions that attack the root of the problem, not the symptoms, right? Because then you're feeding into this endless cycle of need. So I joined Woods Fund in 2012. What are we doing? What am I doing? What am I and Barbara and Rick as active board members, and Chewy as the emeritus chair of Woods Fund, and Amina Dickerson, who was the chair here, was also here, doing to really be a foundation that cares about racial equity? So I'm going to hit 4 points really quickly. So 1, very simply, as I highlighted, we provide financial and other types of resources to Black and people of led organizations to engage in community organizing. So we fund, there's some grantees that I've seen here, in fact, to put organizing and public policy advocacy at the center, which gets at the root of not only giving power or ensuring power to those who are most impacted by structural racism and poverty, but then having the focus on the root problems. The second piece is public policy advocacy. So we also fund public policy organizations, but we fund only public policy organizations whose agendas are directly impacted by those who are most affected by structural racism and economic injustice. So in that way, even if we're funding public policy organizations to put out important research, it has to be tied to those folks on the ground. I think the other piece is this notion of being an organizer within philanthropy, and there are other folks who believe that to be true. So at the end of the day, we're pretty a modestly endowed foundation. We give away between $2.5 to $3 million every year, and we're modest in comparison to other foundations in the city. And so in that way, that it's not just enough for the Woods Fund to care about racial justice and racial equity, it's not enough for us to have that racial equity lens. So how can we work, build, and contribute to a community of philanthropy that is less afraid over time to talk and learn and challenge our own ignorance on issues of racial equity? I have to say this week, I've talked more with my foundation colleagues about racial equity than I have probably in the past year and a half. And I think a lot of that was spurred on by this work that the Trust has kind of created as it relates to On the Table. But it's also been intentional on the part of Woods Fund to engage with our foundation colleagues to engage in racial equity training, to have conversations over reports, to watch films together. In fact, Karenina, who's here as well, she's begun sponsoring this Thursday Think, with foundation colleagues and others at Woods Fund. Every third Thursday, we're going to watch documentaries, we're going to talk about articles, and we're going to talk about the uncomfortable issue of racial equity. And we're going to get used to being uncomfortable we're going to get used to being comfortable being uncomfortable. And so the last thing that I'll say, and Barbara's a part of this, and Juwanza, who is here, is also part of this, is that we're part of this Kellogg work, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. So if I talk about the piece that I think has not yet been injected or needs to be injected more into this conversation about racial justice and racial equity is this sense of love and healing within our own selves and with each other. And so last night, many of us were at the Chicago African Americans in Philanthropy, and this artist, organizer Malcolm London, kind of reminded us of this quote by MLK, which is, justice is what love looks like in public, right? And so data and this scientific evidence is critically important, and history is important. But we need to see that justice is a reflection of who we are as well. And so we need to tend to the heart part of this. And it's a journey that we're glad to be a part of.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So, just want to thank the organizers here at UIC for the invitation to join you all this afternoon and to be part of the very, enlightened and spirited dialogues that have really marked our time together so far. I have to say, it's interesting kind of stepping out behind, the keyboard and writing and talking to people, regularly about a lot of the issues that, are highlighted in the report. And it's another thing to actually, engage in conversation with others directly and really, speak to experiences that you felt directly. Just me personally, born and raised on the South Side, did both of my degrees here in the Chicago area. So, so much of what's in the report, and I'm sure many of you in here can relate, I've directly, felt in my life or have witnessed it firsthand with friends, with loved ones, with classmates, et cetera. And so I have to say, of course, a lot of what was in this report was not surprising. It doesn't make it any more, or any less, I should say, horrific. But, one of the things I do want to do is just highlight, because I speak, here, mainly from the perspective of, what's happening in terms of, public dialogue and discourse around a lot of different racial justice issues. And I think, we need to just be aware of how we are examining that narrative. So, I can speak from, that experience. But what I want to do, just really quickly, if I may, for a show of hands, how many of you, or however you want to identify yourself, would categorize yourself as a millennial? So a few of us. Not a lot of us.
I'll join you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And zooming out a bit, I think that's something to consider as we, think about where we go from here, and making sure, that we're asking the question of who's in the room and who's not in the room, and especially as it relates to the millennial generation, quite, a lot of us, we're a very big, bustling group, and we are and a lot of the boomer generation is starting to retire. A lot of institutional knowledge, could potentially go out the door, with older generations if there is not an intergenerational component to a lot of the work being done. And it's not because young people of color, in particular, are not engaged or galvanized. There are quite a few organizations here, and I could name many, that are led for and by Black and brown young people who want to do the work. But is the public aware of the work they're doing? Is the public, engaged in, the ideas that they're bringing forth, aside from looking at protest? But I do want to highlight here, according to the 2015 American Community Survey, we make up roughly a third of the city's population, and as this week report notes, many Black and Latinx Chicagoans were greatly hit by were particularly hit hard by the Great Recession, in ways that weren't experienced by our white counterparts. And millennials of color, a lot of us were included in that number, and of course we've had to face, disproportionate employment rates, as well as, a lot of barriers to educational attainment. So, it's disturbing, for me, as a Black millennial to see that there's so many opportunities for us to enter the fore, but, we have so many barriers to getting there. We could be starting and innovating new businesses that reflect a growing digital economy and rise into positions of leadership in our community and in politics, and indeed devise new ways of addressing, longstanding issues of inequity. But if millennials of color and the generation coming up behind us don't have the necessary resources, or we don't have the access to spaces like these, or the access to knowledge about how to navigate various political and institutional settings, it's going to be that much harder for us to have a seat at the table, let alone find where the table is in the first place, or even make some of our own tables to share with the community. So that means it's going to be white millennials, is shaping now, who are going to have that disproportionate access to jobs, to housing, to economic, healthcare, educational opportunities, and be positioned to attain them at higher rates. And that's readily apparent in the report's, findings on the rates of educational attainment along the lines of race and gender, especially as it relates to K through 12 public schools. So, it's very important that millennials be a very integral part of the discussions about solving racial inequities, especially because of what we've seen by way of organizing in racial justice and how that can be directly tied to millennials of color. And just going on, from there, I want to also highlight that millennials are also the most diverse generation in American history, and that because of that, there are a lot of shifting perspectives amongst the generation, but there's still a pervasive notion about colorblindness and the notion that racism is more subtle now and it's not as overt as it once was, so there's no need to really drill down the issues. And that's where there's a huge opportunity to reshape the narrative. And MTV commissioned a great study on that Better Look Different campaign in 2014 that I think would be great to highlight here as well in terms of looking at how those attitudes are shaping. And so, we can't just let it go out of sight, out of mind. We have to figure out ways that we can reshape and reframe the narrative in ways that can gain traction. So that leads me to a second point, which I'll make quickly here, is the need to, reframe and reshape the narrative around racial inequities here in Chicago. Because so many of these issues that are outlined here, as well as supporting data, can and should be understood directly by the public as racial justice issues, but the story isn't being told that way. Because what we're facing here, and I read the report, it's not subtle. Mm-hmm. And if you've experienced it firsthand, you're going to know. While we do need indeed to address issues of gun violence, that can't and shouldn't be the end-all be-all when we talk about the experiences of communities of color, as well as policing. Those, again, are very important areas of emphasis. And a lot of that comes by way of what we've seen, in the streets and by way of the 2016 election season. So it's important to consider this as it pertains to media engagement in particular, as well as public education campaigns. And part of that is breaking down and finding ways to make the data and the support easily digestible, but also personalizing it so that there's empathy. And so people are first in the storytelling, because if data is great and we need data, it's absolutely essential. However, we need to be able to put faces, names, and experiences to this information so that more people can readily enter the fore of the conversation. And a lot of what we see in the news now tends to be reductive around racial justice in particular. And one of the things we talked about at our table, during the lunch discussion, was around economic injustice and how, in the aftermath of the election, was framed around the postmortems looking at the white working class as though working class people of color do not need to be focused on. And that's something where the media took that narrative and ran with it. But we have to help where we can, those of us who, are nonprofits or who are scholars, redirect them in ways to really drill down in on those experiences that, get it everyday people, is what I'm trying to say here. Go where they are and try to find ways to step outside of the data and bring it back to the people. And I'll go from there to my last point, because I just want to be respectful of time and my other panelists. I had a lot of things to say based on this report, but I do want to just be brief here. I think, and this was also mentioned this morning, but I think it's also important in terms of public awareness and education to make it very clear and visible, that there's solidarity across various racial justice movements, and to build that wherever possible. And one of the examples that I can think of, from my own reporting, is seeing how the weekend during Trump's executive actions on immigration, there were a cross-section of various racial justice organizations that were scrambling to protect the people at the airports, but made a point to show a united front together to really highlight for the public that immigration, is a broad issue that cuts across various racial and cultural groups, not in terms of just this reductive narrative around how it primarily, and it does, of course, overwhelmingly affect, Muslim populations and Mexicans as it was framed in the election season. But having that moment, especially in Chicago, really for a lot of people made it clear, and in many surprising ways for some, that these issues cut broad and cross-sectional. So wherever possible, we also need to be looking at opportunities to not operate in silos and build and work together across difference. I'll leave it there and take it on to the next panelist.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate on this panel and to make some remarks. First of all, I want to complain that my name on my cookie was misspelled to the Institute. They got it right on my nameplate, so I appreciate that. Number two, this is another sort of a complaint. I had just finished giving a speech entitled Ending the Tale of Two Cities to a very political crowd about 3 weeks ago. And then you come out with a tale of three cities, which means I have to go back to the drawing board on what I put forward. But having said that, this is how I see the importance and the timeliness of the report that you have put forward, the tale of three cities. It comes after a couple of years after the ACLU report on stop and frisk, which I think opened up a lot of eyes and minds in Chicago. It was followed by the task force report on police accountability, another, I think, seminal document because it has some establishment credentials, and I think that's important in our struggle for police accountability. And then three, the Department of Justice report and findings also telling it like it is, and in my opinion, by Chicago standards, maybe national standards, speaking truth to power. And those are very powerful testimonials about the reality as it relates to racial justice, which is something that is found throughout the report. And then fourthly, the Metropolitan Planning Council's report on the cost of segregation. This report, to me, is a sort of a culmination of all of those things, because while it puts forth some really dire realities, it does so with some excellent writing. So I want to commend all the people that did the research, the expert commentators, because they do a hell of a job. And the thing that struck me most was their optimism and keeping it positive and sort of attempting to show a way forward in the face of these intractable issues that we confront in Chicago, and the question of how do we make our city a better city for everyone? How do we make equity a reality? So I really appreciate that. Some of the parts of the report that really struck me, and sorry, I wrote it on different pieces of paper because I was wrestling with it up until last night. Thank you very much for the homework to the Institute. But on page 16, I think the language is pretty powerful. The term structural violence and how structural violence, the definition that social arrangements that put population in harm's way, is a very good explanation for much of the street violence. The street violence is put into perspective, that it's not everywhere, that it's not rampant, but we read about it every day, and it's one of the first things I look at every morning to see where it happened. Was it back of the yards? Was it Brighton Park? you know, and sometimes I'm like, wow, I'm glad it wasn't Little Village, and that's a terrible thing, because that's not the only part of my district. It's not, you know, the whole city. And that structural violence is embedded in political and economic organization of our social world, which says, you know, something about our inability to have a state budget, the continuing persistent crisis in the city, fiscal crisis and social crisis, because we don't know how we're going to keep our schools open, and we're going to borrow, and it's going to cost us more money. They had a press conference at 10:30. It robbed the media from my press conference. I filed a bill this morning seeking to create a small donor system in Cook County, publicly financed elections, so that we only got to raise a little bit of money to be able to compete, and anyone can compete too. So it's moving the big money out of politics, by the way. I have to slip that in. It is relevant to this in terms of what kind of government we have, and because there's a similar ordinance pending in the city council, and the state senate passed that bill, Senator Daniel Biss passed it just 2 days ago. So this is relevant to this in as far as my role as a legislator on the Cook County Board, and someone who, of course, keeps an eye on Springfield and City Hall. And the other thing is, yes, I too was struck, Grace, by the powerful statement that inequality in Chicago remains pervasive, persistent, and consequential. That's why we're here today, when you really think about it. That's why there's an institute in the first place. So I want to first just say those things. The other part that was really, really striking and well-written, so that the document becomes a tool for social justice activists across the city, the economic section that clearly describes the impact of the restructured economy, and it reminds us that that's really what's driven so much of what we experience that we don't like, that's attributable to the great inequality that we experience in Chicago and that certain communities experience on steroids, and that the African Americans and Latinx, I'm trying to figure out how to say that.
You got it.
That's new to me, I got it, all right. So that's a first. So that leaders or individuals don't engage in the blame game about whose fault it is that we're in this situation. It clearly walks us through the process of deindustrialization and the grave impact of the loss of manufacturing jobs in Chicago. This is good clarity for our organizing and advocacy purposes, which is so key. So the other thing I want to say, because I want to be mindful of our time too, and I had a hell of a time just within the last hour figuring out what am I going to say, because I had to stay up late and I had to finish writing the ordinance, and then we did a press conference earlier today. But here's what I saw as an opening. So segregation is so disheartening in Chicago, and the concentration of poverty, you know, seems to be a story of the past 50 years, you know, since I came to Chicago 52 years ago. And that stands out because even in places like New York and LA and Houston, there isn't as much segregation between African Americans and Latinos. It's Chicago that really stands out, that I think this really helped me understand. I sort of know it because I know the viaducts in Chicago, and I walk one block north and there's a viaduct there, and then there's I live right on the border between the two communities. But this makes it really, really clear, and that it's difficult to organize across those barriers. Barbara, in her afterword, mentions some of the new movements, new opportunities that are emerging in Chicago. The immigrants' rights movement, you know, she analyzes from 2006 to today, the Black Lives Matter movement, the upsurge in school teacher organizing, the low-wage worker movement, and the progressive campaigns. And they're kind to me as they included my name in there in that regard. Could have been more critical, like some of the conversations that we've had struggling during the campaign. But I see two areas that I think are ripe for cross-community organizing. One is the school teacher opportunity that remains there, that I think came together during the strike of the Chicago Teachers Union, courageous, and a big win that I think inspired some of the social forces that participated in the last mayoral city council showdown. I think that is a place to nurture and to grow. And two, because Latinx and Black workers earn the lowest wages in the service economy, there continues to be great opportunity for additional organizing and cross-community organization. So I wanted to mention that because I don't want to end on, on a negative downer. And that there is an intentional effort on the part of Black Youth Project and the Organization Against Deportations, OCAD, and they're intentional about two things that they're fighting for. Expanding sanctuary, which means eliminating exceptions such as the gang database that's been responsible for some of the raids that are going on in Chicago. So there is collaboration between CPD, whether it comes from the top or not. It may come from some of the union members because their guy is egging them on in DC. And two, the resolution challenging the FOP contract and advocating for real changes now that the contract is up. So I just want to give them a shout out because I think this is sort of leading by example how you engage in those cross-community organizing efforts. And why are they important? They're real important because if the city council, Black and Latino caucuses had more pressure on them and there was more successful advocacy, they're a force to be reckoned with in the city council if we could get them to act in coordination. The same thing is true of the caucuses in Springfield. I mean, they could run a political agenda where nothing would pass in Springfield without their say-so, without their okay. And that's part of the reason why I'm onto this publicly funded elections and this small donors piece, because if people get free of having to raise large sums of money and always trying to appease people with money, they can work for their constituents. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I could just say what they said and be done, but I'll try to make a couple of other points. I know Chewy's name was misspelled on the cookie. He has an EY instead of a U, but at least they got your name right here. In my program, I got my name wrong, so no K in Rick. And I always tell people that because there's no K in Ricardo, which is my name, which they got right. So see, I got a little line too there, Chewy. I'm going to try to make you all uncomfortable if you give me permission. So first I'll ask you all to stand up, if you don't mind standing up. Mainly, I don't want you to fall asleep when I'm talking. That's the real reason I want you to stand up. But I am going to make you uncomfortable, and because largely, Derek's work is about, he's a journalist. He's kind of telling us what's going on across the city, maybe across the state, across the country and the world, keeping us informed. Grace's work is about funding terrific work being done out in community, maybe influenced by the public policy that Chewy has helped promote and other organizations like ours have helped promote. So I think we're all related. My job is really to try to take the best of the information I get, use Grace's money to implement Chewy's public policies out in real programs. So, and then Derek also alluded to the fact that we don't have a whole lot of millennials here, but there's another group that's not here, and I'm going to ask you to remain standing if you have suffered or have been part of this. And this may make you feel uncomfortable, but I'm going to start with an easy one. So if you grew up, or even if you have just simply visited one of these communities, remain standing, okay? So back at the yard / New City, Auburn, Gresham, Austin, South Shore. You guys all visited or been there? Okay, that's pretty good. The last group I did this with, nobody stood up. Englewood, Garfield Park, Lawndale, Humboldt Park, South Chicago, South Shore. Everybody here has been there, so it's kind of the choir. So here's where you get. Anybody who's ever been homeless, please remain standing. Jeez. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna let you get back up just in case, all right? Anybody, this one might make some people uncomfortable, so if you ever witnessed or been a victim of domestic violence, stand up. You ever known anybody who has been shot, a friend or a person you care for who's been shot? Stand up. Have you ever been shot at? Please stand up. So you get the point, right? So when I did this, you feel free to sit down. I ran this, Grace has seen me do this before. I ran this exercise with a group of young fathers that my organization, Metropolitan Family Services, works with. And there were, I remember now, 17 or 19 young men in the room. And when we asked these questions, for every single one of them, all the men but two remained standing. All the men but two remained standing. So it was at that point that Metropolitan Family Services, the state's first charter not-for-profit, kind of, for a long time, a white glove organization, kind of proper, middle of the road, we decided it's not enough to just continue to provide preventive services, that maybe we not only should do prevention, but also do direct intervention and help in public policy change wherever we can. So when I read this report, so what does that matter to this report? So when I read this report, what I thought about is Rick Estrada, myself, in 1987. And in 1987 is the day that I read a very similar report, and I was at a university, even though I grew up right around here, I didn't attend here. I was at Loyola, and I read a report very similar to this, and that's the day I realized I'm poor. And I just, I didn't realize up until that point that I grew up in my entire life and I was poor, because it showed with the poverty rates, and I realized I looked at my dad's paycheck. Why do I look at my dad's paycheck? Because as an immigrant kid, that's what you do, and you have to help file the taxes. So I looked at his information, I'm like, we were poor. And so read the rest of the report, as you might imagine, with a whole lot more interest. And it was, quite frankly, not that much different in this report. And I went through the entire report, and it talked about all the inequities, whether they were economic, housing, and all that stuff. And I believe that's the day that I had my educational baptism and decided, okay, maybe I should do something about this. So I was then in the Catholic seminary, and I thought my action was going to be as a minister, and I did a little liberation theology study, and went to Bolivia and did that thing, and I realized, I'm not going to be a priest, but the liberation theology stuff I like. I like liberation theology. Came back to Chicago, and ended up at the University of Chicago. And in 1992, I read another report. Right, it was very similar to this one, and realized, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed from when I was a sophomore in college to now that I'm a first-year student at SSA. And but it was there that I met a woman named Dodie Norton, and she talked about systems theory, and some of us who have been studied under Dodie realize that, and so I think you study it here, you study it across the world, but my job, in order to please Dodie Norton, was to write a paper about, I believe it was the 1972 Gautreaux Act on housing, and I thought my life was going to be about improving housing situation for people across the city of Chicago, and I had to do it through a systems perspective in order to please Dodie. And so where am I going with this? You fast forward, and all of a sudden I became 50 years old, and I read this report, and nothing has changed. And we, in fact, have taken steps backwards. There are communities like Englewood that where residents just fled. In this report you read what the size of Englewood is today versus what it was a couple of decades ago, and it also talked about the buildings and other places that have been shuttered, etc. It is a war zone, and people are fleeing, so we shouldn't be surprised about that. And so upon reading this report, I'm like, why do we want to talk about it? Why the hell do we want to talk about this report? We should be acting on the issues that we are reading today in this report. So it's good enough to read, but if you go home and you kind of read this report and do nothing about it and think that it's okay, and you're going to study and you graduate from this university, some other great university, then you would have disrespected the folks that wrote this report, and you are really not moving the needle forward. So my call to you is that, and to the Woods Fund, and to Commissioner Garcia, and to Derek, and to my own organization is, we've already read them. We read them 20 years ago. They didn't change. So what are we doing to impact all the systems? And I go back to the Doty Norton thing, from the micro, the meso, the exo, and the macro levels. What are we doing to change the systems? And so at the grandest level, the macro level, we need to organize at that level and start bringing real change. We have to stop acting like gangbangers. And I think that many of the groups, both in the academy and in nonprofit work and in public policy and in think tanks that are really do tanks, we act like gangbangers sometimes because we're protecting our resources and our turf just as viciously as the street organizations do. And some of you have heard me speak about this as well. So we need to stop acting that way, start figuring out how to work together, demonstrate to people that you can work together and that you're going to actually live a life with integrity, and that when you say something, it means you're going to share resources and lead with integrity, that you're going to do it. So for me, this report was really another call to action. I got it 20 years ago. I got it, 15 years ago or so, and then I get it today. And so for me, my message is, hey, yeah, fine. We read a report. Thank you. It's awesome. It's awesome. It's just a reminder we need to do more. Thanks.
So thank you. Thank you all for staying on your time. Also, that was wonderful. We have about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes for a conversation. And I just want to say a couple things. I mean, I agree with Rick that there are continuities, right? But of course, I'm a historian, so there's change over time. There's always change. Otherwise, I'd be out of business, right? But so I think one of the things that the report does, and Amanda, I didn't say this at the outset, thank you so much to IRRPP, to you and Dina and Yvonne and others who really saw this through and put it together as a provocation as much as anything else. But I think, what Rick says is, we don't live in this post-racial la-la land that was being sold to us, at least before Black Lives Matter was being sold to us, and before this election season. But the mechanisms by which racism and white supremacy get deployed in our society are changing a little bit, and we have to be mindful of that. We have to map that. We have to have our antenna up for that. The panel was charged with imagining a more just Chicago, and I want to come back to that. I think that really challenges us to say, what does it look like? What would a more just society, or much more just Chicago look like? Do we really all have a shared vision, right? I mean, do we want to jockey for positions in the hierarchy, right? Or do we imagine something fundamentally more transformative? And then, how do we get there? And those are large questions. I'm sure we won't really fully answer them. But 3 questions specific to the report. Julie alluded to this in terms of the challenge of 3 cities, right? The tale of 3 cities, the story of 3 cities. So what does that really mean, and what are the implications for our work? There are new Black Latino alliances that are forging and being forged. There are enormous efforts at the national level, I think at the local level, to bridge that divide. But what are the implications for our work when we map that? We talk about the term people of color sometimes, and that's a political rallying cry. It's not actually defining the common experiences of everyone in those categories. And within, the Black community or the Latinx community, there's enormous difference and diversity. So how do we both forge unity while recognizing the very different levels of power and so forth? And I think this question of criminalization of certain sectors of our community is part of the answer to that, as is expanded sanctuary. I want to raise the question, how integral is economic justice to an agenda for racial justice? And I think, there's one section in there where the report argues that even despite issues of class difference, there is still the experience of racial injustice and racism. That's true. I think that's the subtext, not the text. I think the text is that we experience race in a very class-inflected way. And I think we have to raise the C word, which might make us a little uncomfortable sometimes, which is capitalism. And I, my own training and convictions are we have to talk about racial capitalism, right? And people who believe in capitalism, which I do not, understand that capitalism is currently in crisis as well. I mean, there's Robert Reich has a book, and Rana Furahar from Time Magazine, has a book about sort of capitalism and how you save it. Paul Mason has a group, Post-Capitalism. So people who believe in the project of capitalism know that it's in crisis. And sometimes, liberal and left forces talk around it as if there is a way to reconcile some of the injustices in the society when we really have a society that the very logic of it is to perpetuate inequality. So how do we do that in the frames that we're in, or perhaps how much do we have to get outside of certain institutional frameworks in order to really wrestle with that question? I mean, one of the stark statistics in the study was 275% greater wealth assets among whites than blacks, and it's comparable for the difference between whites and Latinx folks. So that alone gives us a little glimpse of what racial capitalism looks like. And finally, the third, and so the question to the panel is to resolve these dilemmas in 20 words or less. But the final question is one that Derek alluded to around who's represented here. And I think millennials aren't represented, but also a lot of other folks aren't represented. And this is not a critique to, for UIC or IRRPP, but I was yesterday, Coco organized a panel yesterday that I was the token academic to moderate it. But there were people who lived and grew up in public housing who were talking about what needs to change in public housing. I think most of the people on that panel would have stayed standing when Rick asked questions of what are the indicators of how we have experienced the injustices of racial capitalism. And I actually think if we listen to some of the leadership of some of the most active and engaged millennials, they're talking about that question too. When Black Lives Matter or Let Us Breathe Collective or Assata's Daughters or a whole number of Black Youth Project 100 talk about their political agenda, it's talking about the most marginal sectors of our communities. They're talking about the formerly incarcerated and permanently unemployed. They're talking about the people that financialization and robotization have completely put outside of the job market, that don't appear in our statistics, right, because they're no longer looking for work. And so how do we create conversations, if you will, but more importantly, justice agendas that bring those folks into the room on par with other folks with expertise and institutional affiliations. And that sometimes does get uncomfortable, because I think we are then confronted with our own positions of privilege, which I think have to be challenged if we're going to be honest about the conversation. So I just put all that out there, and interested in thoughts and reactions.
I'll take a stab at it because I've got to leave at 1:45. I thought this started at 12, so I had scheduled it as such, and I can't weasel out of my 2 o'clock. I think the fight for $15 as a minimum wage nationally is part of the solution. Given the prevalence of Black and Latinx people in the service economy, and that's nationally. 2, we have to figure out how to get more people involved, signed up as union members. I believe that the most effective anti-poverty program, with its faults and with the racial discrimination that existed and came with it, but it lifted up boats and it was the longest period of prosperity, was after the Depression, when people organized into trade unions. So unionization is critical. I also think that part of the economic agenda has to include a federal jobs program I was hopeful, and part of the reason I worked to elect Hillary Clinton, in spite of many reservations that I had, and as a former Bernie Sanders delegate, was that we had a better shot from an administration that she would head up to see something materialize in metro areas that recognize the plight of so many unemployed Black and brown people, or underemployed, or young people making low wages. So I think that is critical. I think that's critical to the violence challenge that we face in our city. And then lastly, we need to create affordable housing, but we also need to model ways of creating truly diverse communities and development in Chicago. And I reiterate that because I am in some disbelief that the very modest housing development project, actually a mixed use project that Alderman Arena is trying to accomplish in the 45th Ward, has stirred the type of backlash that it has. I think that it may have something to do with the Trump forces. I think it may have something to do with the call for police accountability and for greater criminal justice reform. I think it may be a backlash, but I think that unless you have those ingredients happening simultaneously, it's going to be hard to move our city toward in a more equitable direction.
I think I'm going to take it from a slightly different direction, but I think it impacts everything around our economy. And I think one, we need to deal with changing the narrative that's out there about the hierarchy of human value. And I'm not going to try to define what that means or get into all of its different meanings, but just in one specific situation, because I think it's impacting our entire culture. And it's, I think we as a society have bought into these falsehoods of men of color being less than human. And so we are dehumanizing men, whether it's the African-American males and the perceptions that are out there about African-American males and Latino-American males now, and the perceptions that are out there about them, whether we are less than human, animal-like, that we are violent, all those kinds of things, that this narrative is so pervasive in our society that even with progressive types and people that we know in our family and are of those races, there is that it's pervasive in that, and I think that impacts everything. It impacts obviously the incarceration rates. It impacts the ability and the perception that prevents us from getting the jobs that we are capable of getting. I think it prevents us from. There's less of a tolerance for us if we make a mistake on the educational setting, because of course that narrative is always in the minds of people in power and people, even middle manager types. So I know your question was broad, but on the economic side, I take it back up to the false hierarchy of human value, and specifically around the male. We can get into many other false narratives, but that one I think we need to work on as a society. There is I think as a guy of color, I feel passionately about making sure that we strengthen males of color, and in my sector, in the nonprofit sector, it is primarily run by women, really well-intentioned women. And so let me give you an example. So when we're running parenting programs, and there are many of them out there, it's easy to just say, you know, the dads are not involved. So we're just going to work with the moms. And the reality is we're kind of afraid to work with the dads, and it's harder to work with the dads, but if we engage them, we could get them in, and then we could start making a difference there. So for me, it's a huge issue. If you're going to impact the economy, I think we have to just change that narrative.
And about women too, because women of color there's a comparable narrative about women of color, and the whole Say Your Name campaign has really raised the issue of violence toward women of color from the shadows, and lose my feminist credentials if I didn't add that.
Thank you.
Beth, you're looking at me.
So 3 comments, and I think the question around what would a more just society look like is so compelling, Barbara, and it really turned the wheels in my head to begin thinking about what that looks like. And I, very much agree with what Rick said as it relates to really confronting that aspect of our animalness. And I think one of the things that we were talking about at our table, or I was mostly listening, was that there's this notion that we believe that there's this pie, right? That in order for some others to have a bigger slice of the pie, that it means that others have a smaller slice of the pie. And so, really trying to figure out where that notion comes from, and if it's part of us as animals to believe that if Tawa has the antelope, then I will no longer have that antelope. And I think we really need to begin to have purposeful. So the second comment that I have is we need to have more conversations like this and have racially purposeful changes to policy. And so if we still have large segments of our population, including public sector leaders, who don't believe this report or who turn away from it, right, we're not going to be able to undo what has been purposely done. One of the pieces of the report that really sticks out to me is that purposeful part, that these were not benign policies where accidentally over time, we've reached a point where racial inequities exist. And so I think it's the job of organizers, of everybody. So on page 17, we can all do better, right? So this is not a call to action for just those who have social justice in our mission, but how can we all do better? And it does relate to understanding that the pie is not static. And also that good intentions are not enough. And to Rick's point, apathy is not an option. And so the last piece that I think is core to what we do and believe at Woods Fund is that community organizers and the volunteer leaders who actually are moving and changing society in the direction that we want it to change. And this sounds really cheesy, but I was actually thinking about it last night after our discussion, which is I feel like organizers who are on the front line, as well as leaders who are most impacted by racial inequity and economic injustice, believe in democracy more than probably anybody else, right? Because despite the challenges of feeling that they are unheard, or they are oppressed, or they are working 2 shifts, or they are et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they believe, and they have actually used democracy and expressed it and made changes. Not to the degree that is necessary to get to where we want to be a just society. And so that's kind of my mantra from the Woods Fund platform, that we need more resources to go to community organizing.
So in a way, there was discussion about the humanization of Black men. Of course, Professor Ransby spoke about how that also pertains to women, and it did make me think of a particular anecdote that I think is very helpful for the discussion we're having. A few years ago, when in early 2015, right during the very peak of a lot of the coverage around Black Lives Matter, some of the criticism we got from a lot of Black women and Black feminists was the fact that a lot of the framing around policing and justice issues for Black people were so focused on Black men. So there was a National Day of Action, of course, tied to the Say Your Name campaign. And I did a story for Mike at the time, and when I spoke with Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the things she said really struck with me. And I've always been captured by this quote, and that is, if they reject your frame, they reject your facts. And she said that as it related to making it very clear and highlighting the African American Policy Forum's report on the disproportionate punishment in school and other settings of young Black girls. But as we're talking about this report and how that relates to that, we also have to think about how we are telling the story about the work we're doing, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's scholars, And also, and I have to say, we have to be accountable also, those of us who are in the media and as journalists, have to be accountable to making sure that we are doing the necessary work to drill down and frame these issues in a way that make it very clear and direct that we cannot take a detached approach to talking about issues of education and housing, for example. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a very broad level data visualization around gentrification, for example, that focuses mainly on the changing demographics, but never really drills down and gets at an elderly, Latinx woman who's going to be pushed out of the neighborhood that she's raised 2 generations in because she can no longer afford because of housing policies. Those aren't the stories being told by and large. And the media is going to need help. The public's going to need help, and especially when, according to the survey done last year by the American Society of News Editors, they've done this every year since 1978, only 17% of reporters in newsrooms are people of color. 17%. 17%. Compared to 4% in 1978. That's not a lot of improvement. And so, of course, anyone can can get the knowledge and expertise or try to access as best they can. However, it's different when you're writing from an experience that you can directly see and relate to. It's why, for example, Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times did a really great piece, and I would recommend reading it, on the challenge of finding a school for her daughter in segregated New York City. And that's an example of storytelling that works here. But part of it can't just be, personal narrative is important, but we also have to remember that when we're talking about data, how do we get people, faces, and names attached to, and how do we frame it in a way that makes it very direct and clear who's being affected? And answer the question of so what?
Okay, so a lot to chew on. Questions from the audience.
So this is a little hard because as each of the panelists spoke, I had another question. So I was sitting there trying to combine the questions into one. So first, a half comment and then the question. In addition to who's not in the room, I would have loved to see more organizers in the room, because this is stuff that we work on every single day, but there is, to some degree, a disconnect between policy analysts and community organizers, right? And so part of my self-interest is through this Kellogg Truth, Racial Healing, Transformation process, there can be some of that clearinghouse developed where we have the opportunity to come together like Barbara did years ago at the public square. But it's just there are these narratives that are driving everything that we're doing, right? That we got to figure out how to break down, right? Like to Rick's point, it's like, how many people in the room have not been afraid when they saw a black man, right? Every cop story, they shoot somebody, I was afraid. And it flies because, everybody on the jury, all the prosecutors are like, yeah, I've been afraid too when I saw another black man. So the question, right? Chewy brought this up. Alderman Arena, northwest side of Chicago, Jefferson Park, trying to bring a housing development in to his neighborhood, right? Huge backlash. You got people saying all sorts of racist stuff openly, right? We don't want this development there. You got the mayor, alderman, one of the rare instances where aldermen are saying, you can't have this zoning change in your ward, right? That never happens. But around this single development, that's happening, right? So you got this cost of segregation report that's come out. You got this report that's come out saying things are horrible. There are vested interests in Chicago who want to see business continue as usual, right? How do we push back against that in a real way?
I don't know. I don't know that is that complicated. I think you started with it. I think we need to make sure that the organizing around the city is a whole lot better, stronger, that we're feeding it, that the infrastructure is strong, that the millennials are being trained by experts like you and others on how to do that organizing. I think the work that we're doing on truth, racial healing, and transformation has to be brought to that. I live in that neighborhood, and it's interesting that what's going on here. Not exactly in Jefferson Park. I'm over on the Irving Park side, but Arena's my alderman, and so this whole NIMBY situation is also dividing the neighborhood, and it's a big neighborhood. So I think what you're seeing on the on social media is like usual. It's the loudest, most biased,
amongst the most racist in the neighborhood, and the majority is not as active. I'm not sure why, maybe they're afraid of it, but the reality is, again, we need to give Arena backup. He can't be one of 5 aldermen in the entire city that's willing to stand up for this. So we as a collective city need to give him backup and elect more people like Arena and the other progressive. I mean, I don't know what else to say.
So, I mean, I agree with Barbara in that, you know, Jawanza, you're part of the answer. And, you know, as I reflect on the words of Pastor Ron and your introduction of Pastor Ron last night, as he was recognized for his work, the United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations, I think has that dual role of sprinting as well as practicing for this marathon. Right, and so United Congress is a conglomeration. It's an alliance of organizations across the city that work on issues related to racial injustice. And so the story very quickly is that they spent the first several years of their work together getting to know each other and building trust. Right, so that's the marathon work. So you can't create coalitions overnight without this trust embedded in that work. But at the same time, this was also discussed at our table and earlier, is like, how do you get the Black Caucus and the Latino Caucus to work together at the City Council as well as Springfield? And that's really the job of organizing and making those accountability mechanisms as public officials, right? To have them see that these issues are, again, it goes back to the pie. You know, it's, how do you preserve that piece of pie? Well, you know, there needs to be more of an eye on the whole collective situation.
I just want us to leave with, I think, a sense of urgency. I think, Barbara, you spoke to the issue that our system is in a crisis, and that that crisis is, we are in a crisis, and we can see that through the report that's been presented, but also when we walk through the streets of Chicago and we see so many homeless and we see so many homes that have been demolished and that are not there any longer, and that we're having a conversation whether Alderman Marino should have mixed income housing or not, and it's just a conversation that's taking place. So there's an urgency because it's not about just a conversation that's taking place. It's about people who need places to live. It's about people who need to find food. It's about people who are getting out of prison and don't have any type of services or any place to go or any way that they can sustain themselves so they don't return to prison. So there's an urgency in our city, and I think that's what we need, especially the funders that are in the room, to understand and recognize that there's an urgency and that the funding needs to start going directly to communities. And what we need to start thinking about how we can create a space and a place where communities can hold us, institutions, accountable and participate in the process. It's not about us having a discussion without them. It's about us together having this discussion so that we can transform communities and create these zones in our neighborhoods where people can thrive and build and create. So I just want to say I feel that there's a sense of urgency to this discussion. I think this report highlights this urgency. I think we need more unity among all of us. I think that we need to have the funders put their resources into what they know works, and it has to go to community-based organizations.
Thank you, as somebody who's worked toward those goals for a long time, Cornelia, thank you.
That's right.
So on that note, I think we're going to conclude this panel to again thank IRRPP for the stimulus to have this conversation. I'm sure Amanda's going to tell us there'll be more conversations like this.
Yes, I just want to, I know it's just about 2 o'clock, so we want to thank the panel one more time for these really wonderful thoughts.
Amanda, can I say one thing if I run off? I just want to say that, you know, I think every panel should end with a little bit of more hopefulness, and I think this one ended a little bit, certainly with a call to action, I get that, but the one thing that gives me hope is that, and Derek alluded to this early on, is I think the millennials, and I say that with every ounce of my being, are better than us, than my generation. And I think
that they give me hope in making this city, starting with the city better and then pushing it out across the country.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think there's a couple, as Barbara said, we are hoping to keep this conversation going. This is not an end point for us, but hopefully a beginning. We're looking forward to collaborating we've already had conversations with multiple people in this room about doing another gathering off campus that really is more focused on millennials and youth. And we've also been talking to a lot of folks about getting these kind of conversations off campus more and partnering with different people about how do we have a kind of long-range set of conversations that have a chance to keep going and develop. I also want a couple of thank yous that I forgot. Thank you to the Morton Group. Mary Morton's hiding over there in the corner, but to the facilitators and the note takers who came today and helped the conversations get moving, but also to keep good notes. And we will share them all with you within a few weeks. But especially just a thanks to all of you for coming here today. We are all feeling a sense of urgency about these issues and a sense that we need to learn how to communicate and collaborate more and share all the important work we're doing and figuring out how to deepen and widen and broaden and make all of the resources we have pay off in different kind of ways. So thanks for coming and engaging, and we look forward to more soon. Thanks.